Section 1 of the Shakespeare Apocrypha. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zachary, Trent. The Shakespeare Apocrypha by C.F. Tucker Brooke. Section 1. Preface. This volume is designed to satisfy a need which during the past 2 generations has been variously and often expressed. The ambition of the editor has been to provide an accurate and complete text with adequate critical and supplementary matter of all those plays which can, without entire absurdity, be included in the doubtfully Shakespearean class. A similar work, to comprise the first 13 dramas in this book, in addition to the arraignment of Paris, the death of Stucley, and the siege of Antwerp, appears, indeed, on the list of suggested publications of the New Shakespeare Society. But it did not get beyond the stage of projection. Since the days of Malone, only 3 of the works before us, Arden of Feversham, the 2 noble Kinsmen, and Sir Thomas More, have appeared in English-speaking countries in what can at all justly be termed independently edited texts. Tolerable versions of 4 others have been published by Germans in editions now practically unprocurable. As regards the other 7 plays, no real attempt at purification of the text or collation of the early editions has been made, if made at all, for more than 2 centuries, and in the case of Sir John Oldcastle, it has remained for this book to give the very first reprint of what is most unmistakably the only reliable and uncorrupted version. Thus, considerable and important passages appear here for the first time since 1600. In the preparation of the body of the text, the main object has been to give a faithful reproduction of the most authoritative edition of each play, that is, of the earliest, except in the rare instances where a later edition is demonstrably truer to the author's manuscript. Supplementary passages are printed, within brackets, from the earliest edition which contains them. Where a variant or an amendation has appeared inevitable, it has been adopted. But the reading of the editio princeps has invariably been given in the footnotes. Great pains have been taken, it is hoped with a fair measure of success, to register in the footnotes all variants in accessible 16th and 17th century editions, which are not purely orthographic, and all such later emendations and conjectures as possess any degree of usefulness or probability. Silent alteration of the original has been tolerated only in such purely mechanical matters as the abandonment of the long S, the correction of obviously unintentional misspacing, the rectifying of the most transparent typographical errors, such as flounsers for flounders and thinkest for thinkest, and the introduction of modern punctuation where the sense would otherwise be unintelligible to the ordinary reader. The old punctuation is, however, retained where possible, and all misprints which can conceivably have interest or significance are recorded in the footnotes. The numeration of lines is, of course, new, and it should be noted that the parts of divided metrical lines are often separately numbered for convenience of reference and in order to preserve the appearance of the original page. It is believed that the text will be found as free from inaccuracy as a reprint can well be made. Except for the few additional passages from the 3rd quarto of Mucedorus, personally copied by the editor, transcription has in no case been trusted. The texts of the 6 plays contained in the 3rd Shakespeare folio and that of the 1st edition of Mucedorus have been based on photographic facsimiles of the original quartos. The other plays are printed from the best modern old spelling editions, very carefully corrected by the originals. The collation of the early editions has been done twice to ensure accuracy, and the proof sheets revised by the original quartos. Particular care has been taken to verify readings which are in opposition to those recorded by other modern editors. The general notes are to be considered in connection with the footnotes. They have been kept within modest compass, and their raison d'etre, the explanation or defense of the readings of the text, has perhaps not often been lost sight of. If more general comments have here and there intruded themselves, it is trusted that they will be found always to serve more legitimate purpose than the mere display of all such reading as was never read. Like so many students of Elizabethan literature, I have to acknowledge a large debt of gratitude to Mr. P. A. Daniel. My obligations to him for textual comments and conjectures, particularly relating to The Merry Devil of Edmonton and The Two Noble Kinsmen, will, I hope, be sufficiently evident from the notes to those plays. But for a great deal of other trouble willingly undertaken on my behalf, I have only this opportunity of rendering my sincere thanks. I am equally indebted to Dr. Furnivall for unfailing interest and sympathy, as well as for a number of valuable suggestions for my introduction. And I gladly take this occasion of expressing also my recognition of Dr. W. Aldous Wright's courtesy to me while reading in the library of Trinity College, Cambridge, and since. Finally, it is with a special pleasure that I acknowledge my many obligations to Professor Rowley, to whom are due both the original inspiration for this book and continued helpful encouragement during its preparation. It is my sincere hope that the volume may be regarded as a testimony and a small tribute to the force of his influence and example. January 1908, CFTB. End of Section 1. Read by Zachary Trent.
Section 2 of the Shakespeare Apocrypha. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Shakespeare Apocrypha by C.F. Tucker Brooke. Section 2. Introduction, Part 1. The Shakespeare Apocrypha are indisputably the work of many hands, varying to the extreme of possibility in strength, in skill, and in manner. Not even the auteur Tieck, insatiable in his quest of literary curios, has had the hardihood to ascribe the entire number to the greatest of the Elizabethans. Yet, unequal as they are in literary merit, these plays diverge still more, if possible, in subject matter, style, and general tone. Between certain individuals of the group, indeed, a few similarities may be noted, and a few comparisons drawn. But to attempt to treat the collection comprehensively and as a generic whole would be like undertaking a family history of Falstaff's motley company. These pseudo-Shakespearean plays are waifs and strays of the Elizabethan drama, brought together adventitiously from here, there, and everywhere, and with no common bound but that mighty name, beneath whose broad influence they all seek shelter. Disconcerting though it is to the commentator, this infinite variety yet lends a special zest to the consideration of the pseudo-Shakespearean cycle. The plays are almost without exception interesting, but for very different reasons. Two of them, Arden of Feversham and The Two Noble Kinsmen, and probably they alone, can rest their case boldly on their character as artistic wholes, and claim a position, when judged thus in their entirety, in the very first rank of the extra Shakespearean drama. Three others, Edward III, a Yorkshire tragedy, and Sir Thomas More, failing either in dignity or in unity of outline, rise in parts to an equal height of poetry, a height where the question becomes less whether they are good enough for Shakespeare than whether they are like him. The remaining members of the group belong distinctly to a lower order, that is, except on the theory of apprenticeship work or the hastiest of retouching. Modern criticism can hardly admit their claim of Shakespearean origin to be even plausible. Yet there is scarcely any other dramatist of the period, save Marlowe and Ben Jonson, whose reputation would suffer by the fathering of plays like The London Prodigal, the Merry Devil of Edmonton, or the Puritan. As there is no difficulty in selecting the 5 best pseudo-Shakespearean dramas, so there be little hesitation in pointing out the worst. Literary and dramaturgical considerations would pretty certainly assign the position of discredit to Fair M and Mucedorus, productions that bear the mark of vagabondish on every feature. Yet for the reader of today, these plays, distinctly the weaklings of the flock, possess an attractiveness of their own by very virtue of their dull impersonality, because they display so little of the individual author and so much of the vulgar dramatic taste. Such literary phenomena evolve themselves. They are not created. The writer does no more than drift down the current of theatrical convention, and is doubtless as undiscoverable, certainly as little worth discovering, as the author of a political election song or a low melodrama of a generation ago. There is a curious dramatic irony in the fact that Mucedorus and Fair M have been attributed by serious and respectable critics to the pen of Shakespeare. Composed in utter disregard of probability and reason, with little poetry and less psychology, with no particular merit indeed, but the freshness that comes of complete, unintelligent conventionality, these performances made their appeal frankly to the groundlings. In the case of Mucedorus, at least, we know that the appeal was enormously successful. This absurd play, with the merits and defects of a nursery tale, was acted by strolling companies everywhere till long after the Commonwealth, and passed through 17 editions. Between 1598 and 1700, a record unequaled in the history of the pre-Restoration drama, the only play of the pseudo-Shakespearean class which can at all compare with Mucedorus in popularity with the early book publishers, is a considerably better comedy of similar kind, The Merry Devil of Edmonton. 6 quarto editions of the latter are recorded between 1608 and 1655. It may be added as a commentary on Shakespeare knowledge after the Restoration that Mucedorus, Fair M, and The Merry Devil of Edmonton were bound together into a volume for the library of King Charles II, with the label Shakespeare, Volume 1. The Shakespeare Apocrypha have been accumulating during 3 centuries. Each generation has attributed to the poet, in good faith or in fraud, tentatively or with conviction, the authorship of plays with which his names had not previously been connected. At the same time, certain plays once ascribed to Shakespeare have gradually disappeared from the list, as the actual authors have been discovered, or the absurdity of the ascription has made itself generally felt. In the present state of the case, the preparation of an adequate and practical catalogue of pseudo-Shakespearean plays is a matter of some difficulty. The epithet pseudo-Shakespearean no longer carries with it any presumption as to Shakespeare's authorship. Certain plays, a baker's dozen in all, have acquired a prescriptive right to the title, and must be mentioned in every list. 20 or 30 others have at various times been proposed, with greater or less diffidence, but are still far from having established their position in the category. In regard to these last, each writer on the subject must decide for himself which may be admitted into the doubtfully Shakespearean class without offense to the rules of critical seemliness. The catalogue of a 17th century bookseller, for instance, gives to Shakespeare 3 histories, Edward II, Edward III, and Edward IV. The second of these is universally regarded as one of the doubtful plays, but to admit into the group either of the others, known to be by Marlowe and Heywood respectively, would show an absurdly uncritical deference to the blunder or deceit of the bookseller, the only mortal who has ever hinted at the connection. The long critical history of the Shakespeare Apocrypha divides itself into 3 pretty well-defined epochs. The first, which lasted from the close of the 16th century till well into the 18th, was the age of purely unliterary attribution. Plays were stated on title pages, on the stationers' registers, or in book lists, to be by William Shakespeare, and there for a time the matter ended. No evidence, internal or external, was adduced in support of the attribution, and in few cases or none could the attributors by any stretch of the imagination be called literary critics. Such ascriptions are either the most authoritative of all, or they are utterly valueless. They may rest on personal knowledge or general contemporary report. They may, on the other hand, be no more than the fabrication of an ignorant or fraudulent bookseller. It requires a considerable amount of boldness to deny the possibility of Shakespeare's concern in the two noble kinsmen, in the face of the title page of the first edition, which declares it to be written by the memorable worthies of their time, Mr. John Fletcher and Mr. William Shakespeare, gentlemen, and the evidence of the stationers' registers and first edition of a Yorkshire tragedy in favor of Shakespeare's authorship of that play is perhaps even stronger, because dating from the poet's lifetime. Yet an edition of Sir John Oldcastle in 1600 likewise bears the words written by William Shakespeare, and this boast, absurd on the face of it, is proved mendacious beyond the shadow of a doubt by the record in Henslow's diary of the actual authors, Munday, Drayton, Wilson, and Hathaway. To sum up, we have in the 17th century practically no evidence to indicate that Shakespeare's dramatic activities extended beyond the list of canonical plays, save that of printers, publishers, and stationers. This evidence is worthy of serious consideration in case, and only in case, there are no prima facie cause to believe the witnesses grossly ignorant of the matter, or dishonestly intent on palming off their spurious wares as the works of Shakespeare. The generation of Campbell, Stevens, and Malone ushered in the second epoch in the criticism of the doubtful plays. They and their followers took a purely literary point of view, judging the dramas on Catholic lines and in general with accuracy and fairness, though they suffered from inadequate comprehension of the peculiarly distinguishing features of Shakespeare's art, and placed a mischievous amount of confidence in such vanities as parallel passages and identical archaisms. This tendency of criticism, to which the apocryphal plays owe as much, perhaps, after all, as to any that has so far succeeded it, vanished in a burst of midsummer madness with the wild attributions of Tieck and his romantic satellites. For these last, Germans all, and incapable of appreciating the delicacies of English style, Shakespeare appears to have meant rather a poetic principle than a poet. Dazed by the newly discovered and ill-understood brilliance of the Shakespearean drama, they tended to appropriate to the individual poets qualities of freshness and freedom which, in truth, were the common property of the age. To this misconception and to the desire, so characteristic of later German criticism, to outstrip Shakespeare's countrymen in magnifying his name, is due without doubt Tieck's championship of the genuineness of plays like Mucedorus and George Agreen. Many of the utterances of Tieck and Schlegel concerning the doubtful plays form a crushing though unconscious parody of the general impressionist method inaugurated by Campbell and Malone. The generation that followed Tieck saw the rise in England of the third tendency in the criticism of the Shakespeare Apocrypha. Here as elsewhere, the trend of the time was toward more exact knowledge, towards the careful consideration and classification of minutiae. For the first time an attempt was made, and with a good measure of success, to establish definite criteria for style and spirit, whereby the work of one dramatist might be distinguished from that of another. The most tangible, but surely not the sole result of this effort, is the development of the metrical tests. The new system, however, is at least as liable to abuse as that which it superseded. At its best, exact knowledge of metrical and dramatic details shows itself chastened and directed by broad literary appreciation, as in Professor Spaulding's essay on the authorship of the two noble kinsmen. At its worst, as in some of Mr. Flay's radical pronunciamentos, the ultimately all-important considerations of tone and spirit are either slighted or forced into unwilling compliance with the results of statistical tabulation. The following is a list, as complete as seems practicable, of the uncanonical plays which have been ascribed to Shakespeare, arranged roughly according to the date of attribution. 1. The first part of Sir John Oldcastle, 1600, and this year appeared 2 editions, one anonymous, the other bearing the words "Written by William Shakespeare." 2. The London Prodigal, 1605. 3. A Yorkshire Tragedy, 1608. 4 and 5. The Troublesome Reign of King John, in 2 parts. The title page of the edition of 1611 says, "Written by W.S.H." The earlier edition of 1591 was anonymous. There can be little doubt that the public was meant to interpret W.S.H. as William Shakespeare, and these words indeed appear in full on the title page of the 3rd edition, printed in 1622. 6 and 7. The first part of the contention betwixt the 2 famous houses of York and Lancaster, and the true tragedy of Richard, Duke of York. These old plays were reprinted in 1619 for T. Pavier, the title page asserting them to be written by William Shakespeare, gentleman. 8. The Taming of A Shrew, ascribed to Shakespeare in Schmetwick's reprint, 1631. The first edition is anonymous. 9. The Two Noble Kinsmen, attributed to Fletcher and Shakespeare on title page of the first edition, 1634. 10. The Merry Devil of Edmonton, entered by H. Moseley in 1653 as by Shakespeare. All the early editions are anonymous. 11 and 12. Henry I and Henry II, by W. M. Shakespeare and Robert Davenport, so entered September 9, 1653. 13. The History of Cardenio, a play by Mr. Fletcher and Shakespeare, entered September 9, 1653. It has been suggested that this play is identical with Double Falsehood, number 25. 14. The Second Maiden's Tragedy, entered September 9, 1653, but read in manuscript, and approved by Sir George Buck as early as October 31, 1611. Printed 1824. This is one of the 3 survivors of Warburton's famous collection of 53 manuscript plays, the rest of which were sacrificed by his cook to make pie covers. In this way perish the only known copies of Numbers 11, 12, 13, 15, 16, and 17, which were likewise in Warburton's possession. The Second Maiden's Tragedy was labeled by Warburton a play by William Shakespeare, but has been attributed also to Thomas Gough and to Chapman. 15, 16, and 17. The History of King Stephen, Duke Humphrey, a tragedy. Iphis and Ianthe, or a Marriage Without a Man. All these were entered on June 29, 1660, under Shakespeare's name. Number 16 may be a version of Henry VI, Part 2. 18. The Arrangement of Paris, by Peel, ascribed to Shakespeare in the catalogues of the booksellers Kirkman, Winstanley, and others, 1656 through 1670. 9. The Birth of Merlin, the first edition, 1662, claims William Shakespeare and William Rowley as joint authors. 20 and 21. Fair M. and Mucedorus, a volume in Charles II's library, which contained these 2 plays and The Merry Devil of Edmonton, bore on the outside the title Shakespeare, Volume 1. 22, 23, and 24. The Puritan, Thomas Lord Cromwell, Locrine. The first edition of each of these plays gives the author merely as W.S. The earliest definite connection with Shakespeare is their inclusion, together with Oldcastle, The London Prodigal, A Yorkshire Tragedy, and Pericles, in the 3rd Shakespeare Folio, 1664. 25. Double Falsehood, or The Distressed Lovers, assigned to Shakespeare, perhaps fraudulently by Theobald, in the preface to the first edition, 1728. 26, 27, and 28, Edward II, 1594, Edward III, and Edward IV, 1600, casually listed as Shakespeare's in an early bookseller's catalogue. Edward III was first seriously ascribed to Shakespeare by Campbell in 1760. 29. Arden of Feversham. Shakespearean authorship was first suggested by Edward Jacob in 1770. 30 and 31. King Lear and His Daughters, 1605, and George A. Green. The Pinner of Wakefield, 1599. first attributed by Tieck. 31 is now accepted as Robert Greene's. 32, 33, and 34, Wiley Beguiled, 1606, Satyromastics, 1602, A Warning for Fair Women, 1599, ascribed to Shakespeare by W. Bernhardt in 1856. 33 is by Dekker. 35. Sir Thomas More, first printed 1844. Shakespeare's part authorship suggested by Simpson in 1871. From Mr. Simpson's list of doubtful plays may be added, for the sake of completeness, 36, The Merry Wives, is 1602. 37 and 38, The Prodigal Son and Titus and Vespasian, both preserved only in worthless old German translations. 39, The Lost Hamlet of 1589, and Corambus Hamlet of 1603. 40, The True Tragedy of Richard III, first edition, 1594. 41, Alarum for London, or the Siege of Antwerp, 1602. 42, Albomazar, generally accepted as the work of Tomkis, first edition in 1615. From this catalogue, Pericles and Titus Andronicus are designedly omitted because they have established their position in practice, if not in universal opinion, among the genuine works. It is hardly necessary to call attention to the further omission of such transparent and confessed forgeries as Vortigern and Henry II by W. H. Ireland, and the 5th of November, or the Gunpowder Plot by George Ambrose Rhodes. Of the 42 doubtful plays just enumerated, only 13 can be regarded as having acquired a real claim to the title. To these 13 is added, in the present volume, Sir Thomas More, a play discovered less than a century ago, and destitute, therefore, of prescriptive right of membership. Yet the evidence, internal and external, which can be submitted in defense of the pleasing idea that Shakespeare had a reviser's part in the authorship of Sir Thomas More, is of so interesting and plausible a nature that no apology seems necessary for its inclusion. The following, then, are the names and earliest dates of publication of the 14 dramas here reprinted, which alone appear entitled, on grounds either of reason or of custom, to a place among the Shakespeare Apocrypha. 1. Arden of Feversham, 1592. 2. Locrine, 1595. 3. Edward III, 1596. 4. Mucedorus, 1598. 5. The first part of Sir John Oldcastle, 1600. 6. Thomas Lord Cromwell, 1602. 7. The London Prodigal, 1605. 8. The Puritan, 1607. 9. A Yorkshire Tragedy, 1608. 10. The Merry Devil of Edmonton, 1608. 11. Fair M, first edition not dated, second edition, 1631. 12. The Two Noble Kinsmen, 1634. 13. The Birth of Merlin, 1662. And 14. Sir Thomas More, 1840. The exact likelihood of Shakespeare's connection with any member of this various group must be determined by careful individual examination. On the whole, it may be said, the reader will be impressed more with the unlikeness of the doubtful to the authentic plays than with their likeness. There can indeed be no stronger vindication of the honesty and intelligence of the editors of the first Shakespeare folio, Hemmings and Condell, than careful study of the works which they excluded. As all attempts to deprive the poet of a large interest in any of the 36 plays published by them have so far failed, so it seems in the highest degree improbable that their list will ever be augmented by more than the genuine act or two of Pericles, and a few broken fragments which Shakespeare would doubtless have been the last of all men to include among his works. As regards the fundamental matters of plot and dramatic structure, there is no member of the Shakespeare Apocrypha, with the exception possibly of the Two Noble Kinsmen, which displays special kinship with any genuine play. There is not, for instance, a single French or Italian plot to be found in the doubtful group, and except in the case of Mucedorus and the Two Noble Kinsmen, the leading characters are invariably English. In the Shakespeare canon, the matter is entirely different. If we leave out of account the 10 English histories, we find that 14 out of 27 genuine works have French or Italian plots, derived usually directly or indirectly from novels, while, with the necessary exception again of the 10 histories, the closely associated Merry Wives of Windsor and the 3 mythical British dramas, not a single authentic play is avowedly English, either in scene or characters. Moreover, 7 of the apocryphal dramas belong to a well-defined dramatic species, of which there is not a single instance among Shakespeare's accepted works, and which there is inherent reason for supposing he would have avoided. These species are 1. What may be termed the biographical history, represented by Sir John Oldcastle, Thomas Lord Cromwell, and Sir Thomas More. Such dramas depict in loosely cohering scenes disconnected passages from the life of the hero. Structural chaos is the prerequisite of their existence. To this group belong also the first 2 acts of Pericles, which are certainly un-Shakespearean. 2. The dramatic record of contemporary crime, Arden of Feversham, and a Yorkshire tragedy, are remarkably fine instances of a class which, because it concerns itself primarily with actual physical horror, can scarcely rise to the level of high art. 3. Comedy of contemporary London manners, of which the London Prodigal and the Puritan are examples. This type of drama, superlatively interesting to our age for its richness of topical allusion, is opposed to the method of Shakespeare, who sets his realistic sketches against a romantic background, and never condescends, like Ben Jonson and the author of these plays, to copy the life before his door in all its uninspiring mediocrity. It seems improbable, then, for many reasons, that Shakespeare had an interest in the original construction of any of the doubtful plays. When we consider the possibility, however, of his cooperation in the capacity of reviser or elaborator, there is less cause for disbelief. During his long and many-sided connection with the stage, the poet-manager would doubtless have had occasion to retouch and refine much of the inferior work which came to his company. Several of the canonical plays bear witness that Shakespeare did, indeed, follow this usual Elizabethan practice. But his acknowledged works would not naturally, and do not, include his slight or casual revisionary labors. It is at present a thoroughly permissible belief, though one which can hardly be strengthened into certainty, that some of the splendid passages in the best apocryphal plays are thus the hasty and fragmentary creation of the master's hand. More exact knowledge as to this and other points of interest can be acquired only, if at all, from the study of the individual plays, to the separate discussion of which we may now proceed. End of Section 2.
Section 3 of the Shakespeare Apocrypha. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tatiana Chichilla. The Shakespeare Apocrypha by C.F. Tucker Brooke. Introduction, Part 2. Arden of Feversham, Locrine. 1. Arden of Feversham was entered on the Stationer's Register on April 3, 1592. The same year appeared the first edition, in quarto, Q1, with the following title page: The Lamentable and True Tragedy of M. Arden of Feversham in Kent, who was most wickedly murdered by the means of his disloyal and wanton wife, who, for the love she bare to one Mosby, hired 2 desperate ruffians, Blackwell and Shackbag, to kill him, wherein is showed the great malice and dissimulation of a wicked woman, the unsatiable desire of filthy lust, and the shameful end of all murderers. Imprinted at London for Edward White, dwelling at the little north door of Paul's Church at the sign of the gun, 1592. This edition, of which copies are preserved in the Bodleian and in the Dice Collection, South Kensington, is in black letter. It gives a remarkably good text and appears to have been closely followed by the second edition, Q2, of 1599. The only copy of Q2 known to exist is at the library of the Duke of Devonshire. In 1633, third quarto, Q3, was published. This poor edition, which is to be found in both the Bodleian and in the British Museum, has a different pagination from Q1, and is especially remarkable for the number of words it omits. The murder which Arden of Feversham represents took place on February 15, 1550, considerably more than a generation, therefore, before the publication of the first edition, or the earliest date, 1590, to which the actual writing of the play can easily be referred. Yet there can be no doubt that popular interest in the event was still lively and widespread. Holinshed's chronicle contains a detailed account, which many common inaccuracies and embellishments show to have been followed closely by the author of the tragedy. Stowe's chronicle gives a brief narrative of the crime and its punishment, while the actual facts are recorded in the Wardmote Book of Faversham. To the dramatic talent of Holinshed, we seem to owe the story of the repeated unsuccessful attempts on Arden's life, and the merging of the two colorless individuals of the Wardmote book into the single effective figure of Susan. Finally, the Roxburgh collection preserves a long ballad of 48 stanzas, probably inspired by the play, with the following title: Complaint and Lamentation of Mistress Arden of Feversham in Kent, who, for the love of one Mosby, hired certain ruffians and villains most cruelly to murder her husband, with the fatal end of her and her associates, to the tune of Fortune my foe. Not till nearly 2 centuries after the first appearance of Arden of Feversham was the play coupled with the name of Shakespeare. This service, and, right or wrong, it should be deemed a service, we owe to a loyal but somewhat uncritical citizen of Faversham, Edward Jacob, who in 1770 published a reprint of the first edition with the title, The Lamentable and True Tragedy of M. Arden of Feversham in Kent, with a preface, in which some reasons are offered in favor of its being the earliest dramatic work of Shakespeare now remaining. The only reasons which Jacob actually offers are embraced in a scant half-page of parallel phrases between Arden and various genuine plays, and the similarity thus indicated is of so general a character as to prove nothing at all, beyond the obvious fact that Arden of Feversham and Shakespeare both belong to the Elizabethan period. Footnote. The following is a list of phrases and words for which Jacob cites Shakespearean parallels: such a taunting letter, painted cloth, mermaid's song, basilisk, lean-faced knave, white-livered, buy his merriment as dear, precisian, a raven for a dove, wild cat, swear me on the interrogatories, horned beast, Endymion, death makes amend for sin. End footnote. Around few plays has so large a mass of able criticism accumulated during the last century with so little definite result as around Arden of Feversham. Those readers who feel impelled to assign this fine tragedy to the pen of the youthful Shakespeare have on their side the great authority of Mr. Swinburne and the more hesitating testimony of Charles Knight, Delius, and the Dutch translator Quitert. But the balance of critical opinion, it may safely be said, is turning slowly to the side of respectful incredulity, the side represented by Tyrrell, Ulrichi, Ward, Professor Sainsbury, Symonds, and the editors of the 3 modern texts, Mr. Bullen, Warnke, and Proschold, and the Reverend Ronald Bain. Footnote. For more exact details as to works referenced to here and elsewhere, readers are requested to consult the bibliography. End footnote. In considering the claim to authenticity of the work before us and others of its class, it is but fair to recognize that the reader's sympathies will ordinarily incline him strongly toward their acceptance, besides the pleasure involved in the fancied recognition of a real personality, and that the greatest, behind the frigid mask of anonymity, allowance must be made, particularly on first perusal, for the intoxicating effect of the poetry. In the 5 doubtful plays in which the question of Shakespeare's authorship lends itself to rational discussion, there are gorgeous poetic passages that grip the imagination and overwhelm the reason. If, however, as is the case with regard to Arden of Feversham and its companions, our enthusiasm dies away when we consider the work in its dramatic entirety, or fit the words to the speaker, then surely we should pause long ere we venture on anything approaching a general attribution to Shakespeare. There is nothing fitful or transitory about the true Shakespearean quality. His creations gain, instead of losing, by repeated and various examination, and the very sign manual of his work is the subordination of the expression to the idea, the complete amalgamation of the parts in the whole. Arden of Feversham fails in all of these great tests, and a full century of the most searching inquiry has not been able to add 1 iota to the probability of its authenticity. In such cases, not to advance is to recede hopelessly. Were there enough of Shakespeare in Arden of Feversham to make up more than 2 or 3 purple patches at the most, its presence would long ago have made itself perceptible to the dullest vision, as it has done in the less intrinsically interesting play of Pericles. Mr. Flea and Mr. Charles Crawford have argued with a considerable amount of plausibility that Arden of Feversham was written by Thomas Kyd, who is known to be the author of a prose work on a very similar subject, the murder of John Bruin. It seems likely that there are indeed more parallels in feeling and expression between our play and the tragedies of Kyd than coincidences will account for, but they presume imitation, as Sarrazin and Mr. Bois have pointed out, rather than identity of authorship. Whether the unknown author of Arden of Feversham was a debtor or creditor to Kyd must for the present be left in uncertainty. There is but one character of the first magnitude in Arden of Feversham, Alice, Arden's wife and murderess. It is her demoniacal persistence in the execution of her horrible purpose, while her confederates fail or fall away, that gives the tragedy, otherwise hopelessly disjointed and ineffective, an ultimate unity and a really dramatic spirit. To her, too, belong much of the finest poetry and the two most dramatic speeches, probably, in the play. Yet this gigantic figure is vulgarized and degraded by the two vices, which are most distinctively un-Shakespearean, and which, perhaps, it is hardest of all to pardon in a tragic heroine: purposeless revolting deceit and coarseness of feeling. Through all the dialogues between Alice and her husband, the reader is shocked by the moral obtuseness, the love of clever lying and hypocrisy for its own sake, even when there is no dramatic need for it, which is so entirely absent from Shakespeare's works and so unpleasantly conspicuous in many of his contemporaries. So, too, Alice has little of the sustained delicacy of tragic feeling. From the heights of lofty passion she descends into the deepest mire of criminal brutality, with such words as those she speaks concerning the news of her husband's intended assassination. They be so good that I must laugh for joy before I can begin to tell my tale. For a truly rounded poet, sensible of the dignity and delicacy of tragedy, such lines would be as impossible as the undisguised doggerel of Black Will's leave-taking, which comes like a dash of cold water at the most breathless moment of the play. We have our gold, Mistress Alice, adieu. Mosby, farewell, and Michael, farewell too. 2. The first and only early edition of Locrine dates from 1595. The title page reads, "The lamentable tragedy of Locrine, the eldest son of King Brutus, discoursing the wars of the Britons and Huns with their discomfiture, the Britons' victory with their accidents, and the death of Albanact. No less pleasant than profitable. Newly set forth, overseen and corrected by W.S. London, printed by Thomas Creed, 1595. During the previous year, on July 20th, 1594, the play had been entered in the Stationer's Register. The first definite suggestion of Shakespearean authorship belongs to 1664, when Locrine was reprinted, for the first time since its original appearance, as the last of the 7 new plays in the 3rd folio of Shakespeare. The 4th folio, printed in 1685, retained these supplementary dramas, Locrine among the number, but of the 7, only Pericles has succeeded in establishing its claim to a place in modern editions. The mythical story on which the tragedy of Locrine was founded was current at the end of the 16th century in several forms. Herr Theodor Erb, who has written a dissertation on the subject, believes the dramatist to have followed Geoffrey of Monmouth's chronicle in the main, with occasional borrowings from the versions of Caxton and of Holinshed. The inquiry into the authorship of Locrine begins naturally with the consideration of the initials W.S. on the title page. And here our play connects itself at once with 2 other apocryphal works, Thomas Lord Cromwell and The Puritan, the first editions of which, in 1602 and 1607 respectively, bear the identical words by W.S. Now it is pretty clear, from the evidence of style, spirit, and method alike, that these 3 dramas are not by the same author, whether the William Smith suggested by Malone and Knight or another, and we do not know of any 2 or 3 competent dramatists of the time, leaving Shakespeare out of the question, each of whom had the initials W.S. In 1611, moreover, the early play of The Troublesome Reign of King John was republished with a new claim, written by W.S.H., where it seems certain that a dishonest but cautious bookseller meant the public to construe W.S.H. as William Shakespeare. From all this we may conclude with tolerable assurance. First, that the initials W.S. on the title pages of Locrine, Cromwell, and The Puritan may well stand for William Shakespeare. Footnote. In the case of Locrine, however, the probability of a reference to Shakespeare is much less than in the case of the 2 later plays, both by reason of the former's early date and because of the wording on the title page. End footnote. Second, that such doubtful and suspicious evidence, though it apparently impressed the editors of the 3rd folio, has almost no weight in deciding the question of Shakespeare's authorship of the plays under discussion. Tieck accepts Locrine as the earliest of Shakespeare's dramatic works, and Schlegel registers his belief that this tragedy and Titus Andronicus must stand or fall together on their claim to authenticity. Few succeeding critics are willing to admit the possibility of Shakespeare's concern in the serious part of Locrine, which is indeed composed in the most exaggerated manner of the university wits. The comic scenes, however, which center around the figure of Strumbo, are more successful and more in the early style of Shakespeare. Accordingly, Hopkinson and Ulrichi agree in pronouncing the Strumbo scene Shakespearean, while Hopkinson gives the rest of the play to George Peele. The distinction in tone between the tragic and the comic elements appears, however, to rest not on duality of authorship, but on the change from a very affected type of poetry and a mythical age to prose, and what is, to all intents and purposes, contemporary life. The dovetailing of comedy and tragedy in such scenes as Act 2, Scenes 3, 4, and 5, and Act 4, Scene 2, is much too perfect to be explained on any hypothesis of double authorship, and these 4 scenes, unquestionably the work of a single man, represent all the peculiarities of the play, which I feel a large degree of confidence in attributing as a whole to the pen of Robert Greene. Before, however, entering specifically upon the vexed and vexing problem of the author's identity, it will be well to summarize the more obvious features of the style. Locrine is possibly as characteristic an example as can be found of the type of drama developed by Greene and Peele. The usual faults of their school are in this play exaggerated into vices, but the special lyric beauty, the imaginative fervor, and the delicate feeling for natural loveliness are equally prominent. And both in its defects and its merits, Locrine manifests close consanguinity with the acknowledged plays of the university wits. No reader can well fail to note the infinity of classical allusion, the craze for mouth-filling but meaningless adjectival epithets, the ranting bombast of the heroic figures, the wearisome lyrical repetition of high-sounding words and phrases, or the childish delight in such freaks of verbiage as agnominated and contentation. No less striking, however, and no less indicative of its authorship, are the poetic beauties of Locrine, detached, for the most part, and scattered like living springs in the dreary waste of rhetoric and affectation. There are few touches of purer pastoral feeling, even in Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay, or in The Arraignment of Paris, than Estrel's description of England. The airy hills enclosed with shady groves, the groves replenished with sweet chirping birds, the birds resounding heavenly melody, etc. Or the allusion to the fields of martial Cambria, close by the boisterous Iscan's silver streams, where lightfoot fairies skip from bank to bank. The enthusiasm for external life and action, bound up so closely with the reflective tendencies of the university wits, is worthily expressed in Hubba's martial speech, and in the splendid outburst of national feeling in Act 4, Scene 1, lines 28 to 37. Malone has put it on record as his creed that this play was written by Christopher Marlowe, whose style it appears to me to resemble more than that of any other known dramatic author of that age. It is to be hoped that Mr. Malone's creed contained other saving articles, else his hopes of salvation must be reckoned to be small, for with the exception of a few of the generic qualities just mentioned, which Marlowe also shared, there is not a jot of resemblance between the two styles. Indeed, it is perhaps a degree less possible to imagine Marlowe the author of the flatter and feebler parts of Locrine than to believe them the output of the youthful Shakespeare himself. The various-minded Mr. Flea has several times decided upon Peele as the author of our play, and Hopkinson is of the same opinion as regards the tragic portion of the piece. Peele's authorship, at least in the present state of our knowledge of that poet, is no such self-evident impossibility as that of Shakespeare or Marlowe, but it seems for many reasons improbable. The importance, character, and success of the cosmic element, the excessive richness of mythological allusion, far greater than in any play of Peele's and differently employed, the extreme rarity of run-on lines, and the general appearance of over-decoration all indicate that the author of Locrine is not Peele, and that he is Peele's more humorous, but weaker and more florid companion, Robert Greene. In the discussion of Greene's special claims to the play of Locrine is involved the consideration of another play, closely and curiously linked to ours. The first part, that is, of the tragical reign of Salamis, sometime Emperor of the Turks, published anonymously in 1594 by the same Thomas Creed who brought out Locrine, Alphonsus, The Looking-Glass, and James IV. Mr. P. A. Daniel first called attention to the connection between Salamis and Locrine, a connection so close as to prove indisputably either common authorship or conscious plagiarism. The one comic passage in Salamis is appropriated bodily from Locrine, Act 4, Scene 2, and the two works have more identical or similar lines than could easily be enumerated. Sometimes considerable passages in one play are repeated in the other with the change of only a word or two. For an imposing but by no means exhaustive array of parallel passages and a discussion of the relationship of the two dramas, the reader may be referred to Mr. Churton Collins's Introduction to Greene's works. Mr. Charles Crawford has further shown that some of the more elaborate parallel passages in Locrine and Salamis are imitations of lines in Spenser's Ruins of Rome, which was probably known in MS some years before its publication in 1591. Dr. Grosart has claimed Salamis for Greene and on the whole with a greater show of probability than Mr. Collins is willing to allow. The fact that 6 selections from this drama are quoted in England's Parnassus, 1600, over the name of R. Green, ought surely to be given very considerable weight when there is no contradictory external evidence, and when the internal evidence must be agreed to point in the same direction. In the variety and amount of mythological reference, in general dramatic structure, in the number and kind of borrowings from Spenser, Marlowe, and Green himself, there is little doubt that Salamis bears more likeliness to Orlando Furioso and Alphonsus, King of Aragon, than to the work of any other contemporary writer. As for Mr. Crawford's fine-spun theory that Salamis, with its multiplex heroes, disjointed plot, frequent rhyme, and total absence of any strikingly original situation or poetry, is the production of Christopher Marlowe, it is assuredly not unjust to pronounce the suggestion worthy of keeping company in the limbo of rash and unbalanced criticism with Mr. Simpson's arguments in defense of Shakespeare's authorship of Fair M, and with that egregious sentence of Schlegel, which declares that Cromwell and Oldcastle deserve to be classed among his best and maturest works. Robert Greene's early dramatic method is marked by 2 features, which especially distinguish Locrine. The first is his constant borrowing of lines and phrases from other poets and from himself. The second is his tendency to beautify himself with borrowed feathers and greater matters, to copy the plot and general structure of the most fashionable work of the hour. How continually in Locrine we find Greene's favorite epithets, phrases, and classical divinities forcing themselves, uncalled for, into the lines will not escape the notice of anyone who will, for example, make a cursory catalogue, as I have done, of the mythological references in Locrine, and compare it with Salamis, Alphonsus, Orlando, and The Looking-Glass. Crawford has pointed out, truly I think, that Locrine is less influenced by Marlowe than Salamis, and that the former play, unlike the latter, does not borrow from the Fairy Queen. I differ from Mr. Daniel in regarding Locrine as the earlier play, and I believe it to have been written before Green fell under the spell of Tamburlaine, and while he was taking his models for tragedy, the species of drama represented by Gorboduc and the misfortunes of Arthur. The choice of subject, the dumb shows, and the presence of lyrical speeches arranged in stanzas all mark Locrine as belonging to this class, as surely as Alphonsus belongs to the class of Tamburlaine. The true, if not very powerful or original poetic gifts of Green raise Locrine, however, as far above the barely respectable work of Norton and Sackville and the unmitigated rubbish of Hughes, as all Greene's early plays are themselves transcended by the first achievement of the mighty Marlowe. Salamis I would take as marking the transition from Locrine to Alphonsus. The trumpet blast of Tamburlaine reverberates through many of its speeches, but the cramping walls of Senecan dramaturgy are tottering rather than fallen. Lyrical stanzas and couplets occur here and there, and the action goes astraying, as in Locrine, from one principal character to another. The sequence I have indicated is borne out by examination of the style, which is most artificial and hyperclassical in Locrine, and grows very gradually but steadily less so in Salamis, Orlando Furioso, and Alphonsus, till the culmination is reached in the excellent simplicity of James IV. Locrine is a tragedy of the type of about 1585. That it could have been composed, with all its dumb show machinery and so forth, immediately before 1595 is practically impossible. Yet the reference in the epilogue to the 38th year of Elizabeth's reign points clearly to 1595-6, and these lines must therefore be considerably later than the play as a whole. There is indeed no shadow of a reason why we should not accept as absolute truth the statement of the title page that the drama in 1595, newly set forth, overseen, and corrected by W.S. This W.S. may have been William Shakespeare, or William Smith, or anyone else possessed of these initials. His identity will probably never be known, and there is no question connected with Locrine which is less worth the settling, for the whole character of the play shows that, but for the addition of the 12-line epilogue, the activities of W.S. can hardly have extended beyond the crossing of an occasional T or the dotting of an I. End of section 3.
Section 4 of the Shakespeare Apocrypha. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dave Campbell of Burnaby, British Columbia. The Shakespeare Apocrypha by C. F. Tucker Brooke, Section 4. 3. Edward III, in some ways the most extraordinary of all the doubtful plays, is first heard of in the Stationer's Register for December 1st, 1595. 3 other entries are recorded between this date and February 23rd, 1625. The earliest edition, Q1, has the following title page, quote, "The reign of King Edward III, as it hath been sundry times played about the city of London. London, printed for Cuthbert Burby, 1596, unquote." The play must have been temporarily popular, for in 1599 there appeared a second quarto, Q2, printed likewise for Cuthbert Burby. From this time, however, Edward III seems to have been very largely neglected during more than a century and a half, till it was permanently rescued from oblivion by the scholarly editing of Campbell in 1760. Scene 2 of the first act and the second act of Edward III are based in part on Holinshead's Chronicle of Scotland, and in part on a novel by Bandello, as translated in Painter's Palace of Pleasure. The only source of the rest of the drama, according to Warneke and Prochelt, is Holinshead's Chronicle of England. But Knight may be correct in recognizing through the last 3 acts the influence of Froissart as well. The Villiers-Salisbury episode, not in Holinshead, has been traced by Dr. R.M. Smith to Berner's Froissart, chapter 135. The 2 editions of the play were anonymous. However, in an exact and perfect catalogue of all plays that are printed, prefixed to T. Joff's Careless Shepherdess, 1654, the 3 plays of Edward II, Edward III, and Edward IV are assigned to Shakespeare. Such an attribution is uncritical and untrustworthy on the face of it, and appears to have been ignored in the case of Edward III, as of course it was in the case of the other 2 histories, till Campbell's introduction to our play in his volume of Prolusions or Select Pieces of Ancient Poetry put the argument for its authenticity boldly and persuasively before the popular mind. The first 2 acts of Edward III concern themselves mainly with a love intrigue. The beginning of the 3rd act brings with it a complete change of plot, and a considerable diminution in dramatic force. Since Campbell, only Tieck, Collier, Tietgen, and Hopkinson, untrustworthy critics all, have assigned the entire play to Shakespeare. But the number of those who regard the main portion of the first episode as Shakespearean includes at least 3 high authorities, Tennyson, Ward, and Flier, while Halliwell Phillips, Tyrrell, and Freiherr von Vincke recognize the authenticity of these scenes as at least possible. In the criticism of Edward III, however, as in that of Arden of Feversham, the trend of modern opinion inclines strongly to the negative side. The long list of those who deny the presence in the play of more than conceivably a few brief insertions by Shakespeare includes Mr. Swinburne, Dr. Furnivall, Saintsbury, Knight, Symonds, G.C. Moore-Smith, Ulrichi, Delius, Warneke and Prochelt, H. von Friesen, and Leibau. It will doubtless be generally agreed by readers of the play that the last acts, dealing with the French wars, though full of fine dramatic poetry, are as a whole not by Shakespeare. And there seems good reason to believe that the earlier Countess scenes, so much more Shakespearean at first sight, are in reality by the same author as the rest of the drama. Whether the scenes in which the Countess appears, and possibly other passages, were later revised by a second hand, Shakespeare's or another's, is a question that must be left open. The supporters of the authenticity of the love episode explain it usually as a relatively late addition, written by Shakespeare to eke out the insufficiently long military scenes. In all events, it is certain that if there is any difference in date of composition, the military scenes represent the original dramatic conception, to which the love episode is subsequent. But there are 2 passages in Act 3 which belong apparently to the very first draft, and which refer directly to the love episode. In the 3rd scene, King John says, "For what's this Edward but a belly god, a tender and lascivious wantonness, that th'other day was almost dead for love?" And in Scene 5, King Edward likewise reminds the audience of the events of the first 2 acts. "Now, John of France, I hope, thou knowest King Edward for no wantonness, no love-sick cockney." The author of Act 3 must therefore have had the contents of Acts 1 and 2 distinctly before his mind. A more definite indication of singleness of authorship is the fact that wherever in the last 3 acts the necessity of portraying actual events disappears, There we find, as in Act 4, Scene 3, a return to the tone and style of the earlier unhistoric scenes. Indeed, it is not too much to assert that the true lover and student of this play will be likely to turn with most pleasure not to the brilliant intrigue scenes of the first acts, which have, I think, a rather cloying sweetness, but to the freshness and perfect sincerity of some of the later passages, uneven and sometimes uncouth though they are. There is a verve and exhilaration about the scene in which the Black Prince receives his arms, and that in which he returns to his father triumphant from the shadow of death, or in the brief 8th scene of Act 4, where Audley passes wounded and dying across the stage, which are nowhere to be found in the Countess episode. The latter is certainly a much finer entity than any other division of the play, but there is probably not a passage in it which does more credit to the poetic ability of the author than this single line of Audley's. Quote, "Good friends, convey me to the princely Edward, that in the crimson browery of my blood I may become him with saluting him." Or the 4, spoken by the second citizen of Calais. Quote, "The sun, dread lord, that in the western fall beholds us, now low brought through misery, did in the orient purple of the morn salute our coming forth when we were known." Unquote. Mr. Symonds has remarked that in case Edward III was written as a whole by some imitator of Shakespeare's Marlowe-esque manner, the unknown author would naturally have succeeded better in his treatment of the love story which Bandello had shaped ready to his hand, than when he came in the later acts to deal with the refractory material of actual history. The nature of the play, from beginning to end, lends special weight to this criticism. Throughout, we recognize the writer's love of noble situations and his sympathy with high-minded characters, but the continual inferiority of his hand to his heart is equally obvious. The inability to grasp strongly the realities of life produces in the historical scenes a woodenness and restraint, which mark these portions of the play as distinctly un-Shakespearean, despite several bursts of magnificent poetry. In the greater part of the first 2 acts, however, and occasionally elsewhere, the demands of realistic sanity are less obvious, and the author has been able to rise to a very great height by his fine poetic sense and delicacy of feeling. Yet the central fault is present here as elsewhere. Notwithstanding their figurative richness of style, their melody and forcefulness of expression, and their real likeness in many outward features to Shakespeare, the scenes between the Countess and the King will hardly bear frequent rereading. Tried by the test of what they say, not how they say it, these passages sound hollow and insincere. The sophistry of nearly all the arguments becomes more objectionable as one knows the play better, as one comes to feel, once the bewildering effect of the declamation has abated, how much the characters guide their actions by the dictates of complex academic reasoning, and how little by the inner voice of nature. Yet after declaring Shakespeare utterly incapable, at the mature period presumed by the artistic finish of Edward III, of the quibbling mawkishness of Warwick and the Countess, the conscientious critic will pause long before he undertakes to name the actual author, one of the truest poets and most ardent patriots certainly of his generation. I would like to see this fine, though very imperfect play recognized as the crown and conclusion of the works of George Peele, a poet who has perhaps received scant justice in recent times, but who in the fire and melody of his poetry rises high above all but the 2 greatest of his contemporaries. David and Bathsheba is only just inferior in its best parts to Edward III, and the 2 works bear a very marked resemblance in all essential particulars. In both there is the basal lack of unity arising from the juxtaposition of a love episode conceived in a vein of rare lyrical beauty, and a military political plot for which the author's hand shows itself less well adapted. Both are characterized by nearly total abstinence from the mythological jargon of Greene, by the peculiar liquid beauty of Peele's best poetry, and by a verse movement which is almost identical. As in David and Bathsheba and the Battle of Alcazar, so in Edward III there is not a vestige of comedy, a fact which would surprise us in the work of almost any writer of the time except 2. For it is a curious truth that Peele, with his immense reputation as a jester and social buffoon, has left us less comedy, and that little of a feebler sort, than any of his contemporaries, save Christopher Marlowe. For the type of ardent but rather undiscriminating patriotism which pervades Edward III, any number of parallels will be found in The Arrangement of Paris, Edward I, and the Battle of Alcazar. It must be conceded that Edward III is a finer production than any with which Peel is at present accredited. Yet I believe that the majority of persons who will compare the first act of David and Bathsheba with the first two acts of Edward III will recognize not only that the general characteristics, merits, and defects are the same, but furthermore that there is nothing in the latter play which was not potentially within the grasp of the poet who could write the former. A few years more of practice, a free hand, and the change from the dry, threshed husks of biblical narrative to the full and stimulating garners of native history might have performed a far greater transfiguration. 4. Mucedorus first appears in an edition of 1598 with the title page, quote, "A most pleasant comedy of Mucedorus, the king's son of Valencia, and Amadine, the king's daughter of Aragon, with the merry conceits of mouse, newly set forth as it hath been sundry times played in the honourable city of London, very delectable and full of mirth, London, printed for William Jones, dwelling at Holborn Conduit at the sign of the gun, 1598. There is no mention of the play in the extant stationers' registers till September 17th, 1618. Of all pre-Restoration plays, Mucedorus passed through the greatest number of early editions. 17 have been enumerated by Mr. W. W. Gregg, the dates in order of publication being as follows: 1598, Q1, 1606, Q2, 1610, Q3, 1611, Q4, 1613, Q5, 1615, Q6, 1618, Q7, 1619, Q8, 1621, Q9, 1626, Q10, 1631, Q11, 1634, Q12, 1639, Q13, 1663, Q14, 1668, Q15, an undated edition, Q16, and an edition of which the only extant copy lacks the title page, Q17. Collier has mentioned yet another quarto dated 1609 upon which he professed to base his text of the play, but it is highly probable that this edition, known to nobody but Collier, is entirely imaginary. 9 of the existing quartos are to be found in the British Museum. To these, the Bodleian, Trinity College, Cambridge, and the Dice Collection add 2 others each. Q7 and Q9, neither of which is important, are the only ones not easily accessible, the former being in Mr. Huth's private library, the latter in the Municipal Library of Danzig. Collation of all the British Museum quartos and careful consideration of the rest show that it is possible to divide the early texts of Mucedorus into the following 3 groups. Group A, including only Q1 and Q2, is characterized by the absence of certain scenes and passages found in all the others. Group B embraces Q3 to 6. All the editions of this group, as well as Q1 and Q2, were published by William Jones. Group C includes Q7 to 17. The first 7 of these editions, Q7 to 13, were published by John Wright. Q14 to 16, and probably Q17, by Francis Coles. In this group, the text has been superficially edited, the spelling modernized to some extent, and grammatical irregularities normalized. The divergences within the various groups appear quite unintentional and are confined as a rule to mere misprints and variant spellings. The title page of Q3 runs, quote, "A most pleasant comedy of Mucedorus, amplified with new additions, as it was acted before the King's Majesty at Whitehall on Shrove Sunday night, by His Highness servants, usually playing at the Globe. Very delectable and full of conceited mirth." Unquote. The title pages of the subsequent quartos are as nearly as possible the same. Most of the critical interest attaching to Mucedorus concerns the new editions found in the texts of groups B and C, and the definite statement in these editions that the play was acted by the King's men, usually playing at the Globe. The editions are certainly not by the original author, and are superior to the rest of the comedy. They include the prologue, scenes 1 and 2 of the first act, scene 1 of the fourth act, a revision and amplification of Act 5, Scene 2 from line 91, and of the epilogue from line 14. The source of the comedy has not been discovered. Schlegel, who had not read the play, conjectured wrongly that it was founded on the story of Valentine and Orson, the subject of a Spanish drama by Lope de Vega. Among the Roxborough ballads, there is a poem which, though hardly older in its present form than the 17th century, differs from our play in several particulars and may be based in part on an earlier version of the story. The heading of the ballad reads, quote, "The wandering prince and princess of Mucedorus and Amadine, both of royal progeny, who being unfortunately separated by means of their parents disagreeing, as fortunately met in a desert, while both resolved never to cease from searching till they had found out each other. In shady deserts there was none but beasts to hear these lovers moan. There these faithful lovers met, their marriage day was quickly set. Tune, the young Phaon." Unquote. Besides the conclusive testimony of the large number of early editions and the circulation of a ballad on the subject, we have several other evidences of the special popularity of Mucedorus with vulgar audiences in the 17th century. The citizen's wife, in The Knight of the Burning Pestle, says of an apprentice, quote, "Nay, gentlemen, he hath played before, my husband says, Mucedorus, before the wardens of our company." Unquote. To the same effect is the following interesting record of the comedy's vogue in the provinces during the Commonwealth. Quote, "The comedy of Mucedorus was revived by some strollers in 1652, and privately exhibited in the villages of Moor, Standlake, Southley, and Cumnor in Oxfordshire, till in the following February they ventured to represent it publicly at Witney. The use of the town hall being denied them, they were obliged to perform it at the White Hart Inn, where a numerous audience assembled on the evening of the 3rd. Unquote. On this occasion several persons were killed by the giving way of the floor, and the town lecturer Rowe profited by the catastrophe to deliver a series of sermons against theatrical performances. The only external evidence which in any degree sanctions the attribution of Mucedorus to Shakespeare consists in the statement on the title page of 1610 and after, that the play belonged to the repertoire of the Globe Company, and the fact of its inclusion with Fair M and the Merry Devil of Edmonton in the famous Shakespeare volume prepared for Charles II's library. Tieck alone has ascribed the whole of Mucedorus to Shakespeare, and modern criticism will no longer tolerate so absurd an attribution. There can be little doubt that the comedy in its original form was the work of some member of the school of university wits. Malone attempted, on the most dubious of external testimony, to establish Green's authorship, and Mr. Hopkinson holds the same view, which, however, has recently been discredited by Mr. Churton Collins. Mr. Flier prefers to give to Lodge such credit as the composition of these crude early scenes carries with it, while H. von Friesen supposes Peele to have written them. The spirit of the school is everywhere visible, especially so perhaps in such a pastoral bit as Act 4, Scene 3. But there is little to identify the individual poet. If he be one of the 3 or 4 famous members of the group, then much of the play must represent hasty or slovenly work. But it is more likely that these old scenes were written by an obscure and only moderately gifted disciple. The additional scenes, written apparently between the publication of the 2nd edition in 1606 and the 3rd in 1610, are of greater poetic merit than the rest of the comedy, and somewhat more in Shakespeare's manner. It is agreed that they fall far short of what one would expect from Shakespeare at this period, yet Collier, Hopkinson, and Simpson accept them, with reservations, as hurried and careless patchwork, done by the master in his capacity of theatre manager. Against this, and in support of the negative position occupied by Flier, Ward, Tyrrell, Knight, Warneke and Prochelt, and Sauffet, it may be mentioned, first, that though the single authorship of the editions is pretty evident, only one of the new scenes, Act 4, Scene 1, shows anything which can possibly be regarded as the imperfect work of genius, while the others display merely workmanlike mediocrity. Second, that all the new scenes indicate the very reverse of haste and carelessness. Their great fault is that they impress the reader as labored. Third, that the style, even in the finest scene of all, is sometimes so strained and artificial as not conceivably to be Shakespeare's in 1606 to 1610. Take, for instance, this couplet in Act 4, Scene 1, quote, "No, no, till Mucedorus I shall see again, all joy is comfortless, all pleasure pain," unquote. Mr. Flier suggests Wilkins as the author of the editions, but the matter is not likely soon to be settled. So much seems certain, that the additions to Mucedorus were written by a person of true but neither great nor mature poetic gifts, who stood somewhat under the influence of Shakespeare. 5. 2 quarto editions of the first part of Sir John Oldcastle bear the date 1600. One, which we may call Q1, bears the title, "The First Part of the True and Honourable History of the Life of Sir John Oldcastle, the Good Lord Cobham, as it hath been lately acted by the Right Honourable the Earl of Nottingham, Lord High Admiral of England, his servants. London, printed for V.S. by Thomas Pauvier, and are to be sold at his shop at the sign of the Cat and Parrots, near the Exchange, 1600. The other quarto, Q2, inserts the words "written by William Shakespeare," and replaces the full particulars as to the publisher's name and address by the non-committal sentence, "London, printed for T.P., 1600. This dishonest and defective text has been followed by the editions of the 3rd and 4th Shakespeare folios, F1, F2, and all others before 1908. There can be no doubt, though, that the anonymous quarto, Q1, is infinitely superior. It contains many fine passages which Q2 has either omitted entirely or hopelessly corrupted. The play was registered by Pauvier, August 11th, 1600. Sir John Oldcastle has many pleasant and a few really good scenes, but there is perhaps no member of the pseudo-Shakespearean group more totally destitute of a single passage which might imaginably have been written by Shakespeare. Only Tieck and Schlegel have championed its genuineness, and the question of authorship has now been settled with a most agreeable definiteness by the unearthing of the following entries in Henslow's diary. Quote, "This 16 of October, 1599, received by me, Thomas Downton, of Philip Henslow, to pay Mr. Munday, Mr. Drayton, and Mr. Wilson and Hathaway for the first part of the Life of Sir John Oldcastle, and an earnest of the second part, for use of the company, £10, I say received." Unquote. Quote, "Received of Mr. Henslow and Mr. Munday and the rest of the poets, at the playing of Sir John Oldcastle, the first time, as a gift." Unquote. From other entries it appears that the second part of Sir John Oldcastle, now lost, was written by Drayton alone. The first part of Oldcastle was beyond question composed for the Lord Admiral's company as a reply to the successful Falstaff plays, which the Lord Chamberlain's servants had been acting. The character of Falstaff, originally called Oldcastle, is certainly aimed at in the slur of the prologue. Quote, "It is no pampered glutton we present, nor aged counsellor to youthful sin." Unquote. The gambling scene between the disguised king and Sir John of Wrotham suggests Henry V, Act 4, Scene 1, while the reference to the thieving exploits of the king's youth is a clear allusion to the first part of Henry IV, and the two mentions of Falstaff by name are reminiscent of the same play. Quote, "King, where the devil are my old thieves that were wont to keep this walk? Falstaff, the villain, is so fat he cannot get on his horse, but methinks Poins and Peto should be stirring hereabouts." Unquote. And, quote, "Sir John, because he, i.e. the king, once robbed me before I fell to the trade myself, when that foul villainous guts that led him to all that roguery was in his company there, that Falstaff." Unquote. End of section 4. Recording by Dave Campbell of Burnaby, British Columbia. Section 5 of the Shakespeare Apocrypha. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dave Campbell of Burnaby, British Columbia. The Shakespeare Apocrypha by C.F. Tucker Brooke, Section 5. 6. Thomas Lord Cromwell, was entered on the Stationer's Register by William Cotton, August 11, 1602. In the same year appeared the first edition Q1 with the title, The True Chronicle History of the Whole Life and Death of Thomas Lord Cromwell, as it hath been sundry times publicly acted by the Right Honourable the Lord Chamberlain his servants, written by W.S., imprinted at London for William Jones, and are to be sold at his house near Holborn Conduit at the sign of the Gun, 1602. A second quarto, Q2, was printed by Thomas Snodham in 1613. The only important variation from Q1 on the title page of this edition consists on the necessary change of the name of Shakespeare's company. Quote, as it hath been sundry times publicly acted by the King's Majesty's servants, written by W.S., unquote. The play was included in the third and fourth Shakespeare folios, F1, F2, and was reprinted by Rowe, Pope, and again separately by R. Walker in 1734 as A Tragedy by Shakespeare. Q2, the later quarto, was as usual followed by the edition of the folios, as well as by Malone, who was not acquainted with Q1, and has thus served as basis for all modern texts. Q1 is certainly to be preferred. The variations of Q2 are for the most part due merely to the conventionalization of syntax and spelling. But there are several cases where the original reading has been falsified by the insertion or substitution of new words. The later editions have no critical importance. Thomas Lord Cromwell exceeds Sir John Oldcastle in all the particular defects of that defective though interesting play, and it has fewer merits. The scenes of Cromwell are disconnected and undramatic to such a degree that the real plot cannot be said to begin before the close of the third act, and there is hardly a passage in the work with the exception of Act 3, Scene 3, which excites special attention. Tieck and Schlegel, to their lasting discredit, have defended the geniusness of this play, and Ulrichi also is inclined against his better judgment to accept it as a very early work of Shakespeare anterior to 1592. Hopkinson assigns the main part of the performance to Greene, but he alone of English critics would like to establish Shakespeare's connection as reviser of the greater part of the comic scenes, and of Act 3, Scene 2 and 3, Act 4, Scenes 1 and 5, and Act 5. Other writers have suggested the authorship of Wentworth Smith, William Sly, Heywood, and Drayton, respectively, but there is strong reason against ascribing the play to any of these. While it appears as absolutely certain as so undemonstrable a matter well can be, that William Shakespeare was never concerned with a single line of it. On this point, it is pleasant to find the first and the last of the critics of Cromwell in complete and emphatic agreement. Malone says, quote, to vindicate Shakespeare from having written a single line of this piece would be a waste of time. The poverty of language, the bareness of incident, and the inartificial conduct of every part of the performance place it rather perhaps below the compositions of even the second-rate dramatic authors of the age in which it was produced. And Mr. Swinburne writes, in the same strain, but with even greater and rather excessive disapproval, quote, Thomas Lord Cromwell is a piece of such utterly shapeless, spiritless, bodiless, soulless, senseless, helpless, worthless rubbish that there is no known writer of Shakespeare's age to whom it could be ascribed without the infliction of an unwarrantable insult on that writer's memory. Unquote. The source of the play is the history concerning the life, acts, and deaths of the famous and worthy counsellor Lord Thomas Cromwell, Earl of Essex, in Fox's Book of Martyrs. The story of Frescobald, which Fox has incorporated, comes, as Malone has remarked, from one of Bandello's novels, Part 2, number 27. 7. The London Prodigal appears not to have been entered in the Stationer's books. The only early quarto, Q1, was published in 1605 with the title The London Prodigal, as it was played by the King's Majesty's servants by William Shakespeare, London, printed by T.C. for Nathaniel Butter, and are to be sold near St. Austin's Gate at the sign of the Pied Bull, 1605. It was next published in the third and fourth Shakespeare folios, F1, F2, in supplements to Rose, and to Pope's Shakespeare, and in careless separate reprints by Walker and Tonson. Footnote. In 1734, both these publishers bought out worthless editions of Locrine, Oldcastle, The London Prodigal, and The Puritan, while Walker printed Cromwell in the same year, and Tonson a Yorkshire tragedy in 1735, in which last year appeared also another reprint of Oldcastle, this time with no publisher's name. All these editions claim Shakespeare unreservedly as the author, and they are all quite worthless, save as curiosities. Naturally, the rival publishers were foes, and Tonson has denounced Walker in unmeasured terms as a pirate. End of footnote. All these editions ascribe the comedy unreservedly to Shakespeare, and their unanimous testimony gains weight from the facts that the London Prodigal was performed by Shakespeare's company, and that the Quattro was printed during the poet's lifetime for Rutter, the publisher of King Lear. Yet in spite of this evidence, and the acceptance of its genuineness by Tieck, Schlegel, and Hopkinson, any theory which supports the play's authenticity may safely be branded as utterly untenable. The London Prodigal deals entirely with humours and manners. Like the Puritan, which it resembles in many points, it depends for its value and effect on the bare plot and the really admirable delineation of the externalities of contemporary life. Shakespeare's catholicity and psychological insight are conspicuously absent, and every principle of his dramatic morality is outraged in the treatment of the prodigal's career. The only supposition on which the attribution can at all be justified is that put forward by Mr. Flier, namely, that Shakespeare plotted the comedy roughly and then left his vague design to be very imperfectly executed by another. Mr. Flier feels certain that the London Prodigal and Thomas Lord Cromwell are by the same author, and Ulrichi ascribes our play to one of the writers of Sir John Oldcastle. There seems no reason for either belief. Considered with regard to general spirit, the London Prodigal is so full of the intimate details of domestic life, shows as much affinity perhaps to the early works of Dekker or to those of Marston as to the writings of any other well-known dramatist of the period. But in Dekker's case, such a theory of authorship would become plausible only if he could be shown to have written for the King's Players just before 1605. We know that Marston's Malcontent, 1607, was acted by the King's Majesty's servants. 8. The Puritan was entered at Stationers' Hall on August 6, 1607, by G. Eld, and published in quarto immediately after. The title page runs, The Puritan, or The Widow of Watling Street, acted by the Children of Paul's, written by W.S., imprinted at London by G. Eld, 1607. The next editions were those of the third and fourth Shakespeare folios, F1, F2, of Rowe and Pope, and the separate reprints of Walker and Tonson in 1734. The first definitive recognition of this comedy as the work of Shakespeare appears in a bookseller's catalogue of plays published in 1656. The authority of the folios doubtless established the belief in its authenticity for a time, and we find Gildon in 1702 alluding to it as one of the genuine plays. Since the time of Malone, however, no English critic seems to have doubted its spuriousness, and of the Germans, perhaps only Tieck and Schlegel have attempted to enroll it among the works of Shakespeare. Crude and farcical as the Puritan is, it contains some good bourgeois scenes of a thoroughly un-Shakespearean kind, and has, moreover, the not very usual merit of making the reader laugh with genuine amusement. The spirit of the piece is light-hearted and pleasing, but it has small claim to consideration as serious art. On the strength of the initials W.S., and for no other reason, the Puritan has been attributed to each of the two forgotten dramatists, William and Wentworth Smith. There is slightly better cause, possibly from internal evidence, to accept the theory of Middleton's authorship, favored by Flier, Bullen, Hopkinson, and Ward. But this attribution, besides being entirely problematical, is not in accord with the certainty first pointed out by Dr. Farmer that the second scene of Act I, with its college cant and reminiscence, is the work of an Oxford man. Footnote. Note, for example, the references to quadrangles, battling, and to the Welsh at Jesus College. End of footnote. So far, it must be generally allowed, rather less than no progress at all has been made towards a solution of the mystery of this play's authorship. Nor can the present editor presume to offer more than a very diffident and tentative answer to the question. Yet there are, I think, several facts hitherto overlooked which appear incontrovertible, and which, if they do not justify a final decision, should at least offer to future inquiry that definite terminus a quo so conspicuously lacking in the contradictory and unsupported theories previously advanced. The most obvious of these facts is the extremely close affinity between the Puritan and the comedy of Eastward Ho, published just 2 years earlier in 1605, and authoritatively assigned to Chapman, Johnson, and Marston. It will be impossible, perhaps, for anyone to read the two plays consecutively without being struck by their likeness in all the more significant and less easily imitated characteristics. The outward details of plot are for the most part different, but in general tone and dramatic method, as well as in a number of mannerisms and personal touches, there is a similarity which approaches near to absolute identity, and which makes it very hard to resist the conviction that the pen of one of the authors of Eastward Ho has been employed in the other play. It is not unlikely that in the later drama, as in the earlier, we have to do with a case of collaboration. The connection of the Puritan with Bartholomew Fair would be explained if we could prove Ben Jonson to have been concerned in the former. But I feel much more sure of the authorship of John Marston, who, like the creator of Pieboard, was a member of Oxford University, and whose special traits, as known from his independent works and partially distinguishable in the tangled mesh of Eastward Ho, are conspicuous in the Puritan. The outlook upon London life in the last two dramas is practically identical. Both are realistic in the coarsest sense, and the types are the same, representing and satirizing in the one play as in the other the two hostile classes of court and city. Touchstone and Sir Geoffrey, Quicksilver and Master Edmund have little to distinguish them. Sir Petronel is but a composite of Pieboard and Pennydub, with the villainy of the first and the inanity of the second. But the greatest resemblance appears in the female characters. Gertrude and Moll, one hopes and believes, can have but one creator. Both are revolting to the fingertips, twin embodiments of middle-class vulgarity without a shade of difference. With their craving for coaches and ladyship, their loud expressed dread of leading apes in hell, their continued mouthing of obscenities, they illustrate what, in one of the few pregnant phrases to be found in German dissertational literature, has been called the schmutzige Spur, which Marston's hand leaves ever behind it. How often minor allusions in the Puritan answer to similar references in Eastward Ho may be seen to a small extent from the notes to the former play. Both presume an encyclopedic knowledge on the author's part of the counter-prison, with its manners and customs, its denizens and apartments. In both also we find sarcastic references to King James' new-made knights, though the allusions in the Puritan are somewhat milder than the bold satire of Eastward Ho, which assisted in drawing down upon Marston's innocent associates the wrath of the sovereign. The two plays, likewise, were acted by what was practically the same company, though in the 3 years that separated them its name and personnel had suffered alteration. In both dramas before us there are frequent parodies and imitations of Shakespeare, humorous often, but not unkindly. In the one we have the changes rung on Pistol's rants about the welkin, and see Hamlet a footman entering in haste for the purpose of being asked, "Hamlet, are you mad?" to the delectation probably of an audience already beginning to addle its brains and lose its temper over this infinitely discussed question. In the other play, that which immediately concerns us, Puddock and Ravenshaw serve Pieboard as Falstaff has been served by their colleagues Fang and Snare, while Corporal Oath is made to sit, instead of Banquo's spectre, as, quote, "the ghost i'th white sheets at upper end of the table," unquote, and the mighty tragedy of the fifth act of Othello is burlesqued by the imitation of Pieboard, Skirmish, and Oath. A further characteristic of the Puritan which can hardly fail to impress the careful reader is the especial bitterness of the author against his Puddocks and Ravenshaws. It is obvious that he looks upon himself as belonging to the poor scholar class, and that if he does not regard Pieboard as a friend and a brother, he at least resents in a very personal way the insults and indignities to which the latter is subjected by the minions of the law. It seems certain that there must have gone into the vivid portraiture of the poltroonery, brutality, and rapacity of Yeoman Dogson and his confederates, and into the realistic delineation of conditions in the counter, a very considerable amount of unpleasant personal experience. The general similarity of the Puritan to Bartholomew Fair is of course obvious, and has been alluded to repeatedly. For the most part, the likeness is one of subject rather than treatment, and has no great significance. But in the case of a few details, it merits more serious consideration. I cannot but think that the rough sketch of Master Fullbelly the minister, who is an excellent feeder and will be horribly drunk upon occasion, though he rails against players mightily, because they once brought him drunk upon the stage, stood clear before the memory of Ben Jonson when he came in 1614 to immortalize the race of Fullbellies in Zeal of the Land Busy. The name of the central figure in the Puritan, George Pieboard, is probably a punning allusion to George Peele, who was the perpetrator, according to contemporary story, of 2 of the tricks described in the comedy. For any more definite information as to the source and authorship of the play, we must be content to await the discovery of further facts. 9. A Yorkshire tragedy has from its first appearance been coupled with the name of Shakespeare. On May 2, 1608, it was entered in the Stationers' Register by the notorious Thomas Pavier, the publisher of Oldcastle, as a play by William Shakespeare. A quarto, Q1, followed at once, with the title A Yorkshire Tragedy, Not So New as Lamentable and True, acted by His Majesty's Players at the Globe, written by W. Shakespeare, at London, printed by R.B. for Thomas Pavier, and are to be sold at his shop on Cornhill, near to the Exchange, 1608. At the top of the first page of the text is the heading, All's One, or one of the 4 plays in one, called A Yorkshire Tragedy, as it was played by the King's Majesty's Players, unquote. 11 years later, a second quarto, Q2, was issued with the imprint Written by W. Shakespeare, printed by T.P. 1619. The text of this latter edition, though inferior to that of Q1 and the few points of difference, was followed by the editors of the 3rd and 4th Shakespeare folios, F1, F2, Rowe, Pope, and Tonson. The murders represented in A Yorkshire Tragedy occurred in 1605, and are thus recorded in Stow's Chronicle. Quote, Walter Caverley, of Caverley in Yorkshire, Esquire, murdered 2 of his young children, stabbed his wife into the body with full purpose to have murdered her, and instantly went from his house to have slain his youngest child at nurse, but was prevented. For which fact, at his trial in York, he stood mute, and was judged to be pressed to death, according to which judgment he was executed at the Castle of York on the 5th of August, 1605. Unquote. This sensational crime, as might be supposed, attracted no less attention than the earlier murder of Arden. At least 3 narrative accounts of it were licensed within a couple of months on its occurrence. On June 12, 1605, a pamphlet was entered with the title, quote, A book called 2 Unnatural Murders, the one practised by Master Coverley, a Yorkshire gent, upon his wife, and happened on his children the 23rd of April, 1605, unquote. In July, we have notice of, quote, A ballad of lamentable murder done in Yorkshire by a gent upon 2 of his own children, sore woundings his wife and nurse, unquote. And on August 24, we hear already of, quote, The arraignment, condemnation, and execution of Master Caverley at York in August 1605, unquote. The authenticity of the Yorkshire tragedy has been allowed by Stevens, Ulrichi, Hopkinson, and Ward, and others, but the case which has been made out for the negative by Malone, Tyrrell, Knight, Holywell Phillips, Symonds, and Swinburne seems much the stronger. The barbaric force of the play and the splendor of some of the prose it contains cannot fail to impress the reader, but the late date, 1605 to 1608, is in itself an almost conclusive argument against the possibility of Shakespeare's authorship. Neither in characterization nor in plot nor in metrical peculiarities have the most ardent defenders of the Yorkshire tragedy's authenticity pretended that there is any approach to Shakespeare's manner subsequent to 1605. There are only 2 really considerable characters in the tragedy, the husband and the wife, and they are represented in a quite un-Shakespearean fashion. Each is a mere type, not even invested with a name, and quite without the definite personality that Shakespeare in his maturity gives even to subordinate figures. The husband is a brilliant incarnation of wild fury and misdirected remorse. An unreasoning hatred of the world in which he has played so ignoble a role, and the ever-present consciousness of personality and family disgrace, drive him to seek momentary relief in brutish violence. The wife typifies the opposite extreme, of rather unattractive docility. When this is said, there is little more to say. Few or none of the individualizing and humanizing touches that Shakespeare gives his characters are here to be found. The plot itself, in its nature narrow, sensational, and quite devoid of the morality of all Shakespeare's later work, speaks loud against the possibility of his authorship. To admit all this, as has been done, and explain a Yorkshire tragedy as a sudden excursion by Shakespeare during the last decade of his life into a new and essentially lower field of literature, is to join the critical school of the now famous friend of Schlegel, who defended the authenticity of the Puritan on the grounds that it was a successful attempt of Shakespeare to forsake his own style and write for once in that of Ben Jonson. Finally, the verse of the Yorkshire tragedy has few, if any, of the characteristics of Shakespeare's later verse. The end-stop lines amount to about 88%, an exceedingly high proportion for late work, while as many as 20% of the verse lines, 2 in every 10, are in rhyme. This large number of rhyming lines is not to be found in any but the earliest of the genuine plays, and the rhymes, moreover, are frequently obtained by means of distortion in the word order, such as Shakespeare was not reduced to even in his apprentice work. The following 6 lines exemplify the quality of verse to be found in the duller parts of a Yorkshire tragedy. Quote, "Oh, that I might my wishes now attain, I should then wish you living were again. Though I did beg with you, which thing I feared, oh, 'twas the enemy my eyes so bleared. Oh, would you could pray heaven to me forgive, that I would unto my end repentant live." If Shakespeare's hand is to be traced anywhere in this play, we must look for it solely in the 200 lines of prose scattered through the first 4 scenes. Some of this prose is indeed very fine, particularly the opening scene between the servants and the splendid monologue of the husband in scene 4. The latter passage of 25 lines, to the beginning of the feeble verse appendage, is certainly the poetic climax of the play, and perhaps not unworthy of Shakespeare. Yet it may be denied most emphatically that there is, here or elsewhere, anything, either in thought or in expression, which bears credible witness to the presence of the true Shakespearean touch. As the heading of the first page of the quartos indicates, the brief Yorkshire tragedy, which runs to little over 700 lines, was performed in connection with 3 other dramatic fragments. It is probable that these last were of yet cruder workmanship than our play, and that no effort was made to preserve them from oblivion once they had served their turn upon the stage. Their connection with the Yorkshire tragedy may have been solely a matter of theatrical convenience, but it is at least possible that some or all of them concerned the earlier history of Calverley and presented much the same incidents which Wilkins has used in The Miseries of Enforced Marriage. End of section 5. Recording by Dave Campbell of Burnaby, British Columbia.
Section 6 of the Shakespeare Apocrypha by C.F. Tucker Brooke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Shakespeare Apocrypha by C.F. Tucker Brooke. 10. The Merry Devil of Edmonton was entered on the Stationer's Register October 22nd, 1607, the author's name being omitted. A second entry on April 5th, 1608, referring to a, quote, book called The Life and Death of the Merry Devil of Edmonton by T.B., unquote, alludes certainly to a prose work by Tony Brewer, which has only the remotest connection with our comedy. The latter, however, is again mentioned on the books of the Stationers' Company, and for the first time coupled with Shakespeare's name in a re-entry by H. Moseley, the book publisher, on September 9, 1653. There are 6 17th-century editions of The Merry Devil of Edmonton, all in quarto and all anonymous. The first, Q1, dated 1608, is to be found in the library of Trinity College, Cambridge, and bears the following title page, quote, The Merry Devil of Edmonton, as is hath been sundry times acted by his Majesty's servants at the Globe on the Bankside, London, printed by Henry Ballard for Arthur Owenson, dwelling at the sign of the White Horse in Paul's Churchyard, over against the great north door of the Pauls, 1608, unquote. Other quartos followed in 1612, Q2, 1617, Q3, 1626, Q4, 1631, Q5, 1655, Q6. The text of this play abounds in difficulties. and a few passages seem hopelessly corrupt. The later editions sometimes correct misprints and insert emendations, but they throw little light on the real obscurities and have no independent authority. Altogether, though, none of the quartos can perhaps be regarded as decidedly the best intrinsically. Q1, which gives as good sense as any and stands nearest the original, appears to offer the best basis for modern editions, and has here regularly been followed. The Merry Devil of Edmonton was as popular in the theatres as it appears to have been with the reading public. Reed first quoted what is probably the first extant mention from the Black Book of T.M., 1604. Quote, "Gie him leave to see the Merry Devil of Edmonton, or a woman killed with kindness." Unquote. From this we see that the play had attained a general reputation on the stage at least 3 years before it was registered for publication. Its vogue must indeed soon have become proverbial, for Ben Jonson asks in the prologue to The Devil is an Ass, quote, "And show this but the same face you have done, your dear delight, the Devil of Edmonton." Unquote. In Cunningham's Revel's accounts, there is the following mention of her performance before the king, quote, "To the said John Hemmings, upon a warrant dated 15 May, 1618, for presenting before his Majesty the 3rd of May, the Merry Devil of Edmonton, 10." Unquote. It is not unimportant to note, if this extract can be relied on, and there seems no cause to suspect a forgery, that the presentation here referred to took place only 2 years after Shakespeare's death, and 5 before the publication of the first folio. If, then, Hemmings later failed to include the Merry Devil of Edmonton in his edition of Shakespeare's works, it could not be because the play had not been brought conspicuously before his attention. The external evidence which has been collected to prove Shakespeare's authorship of the Merry Devil of Edmonton is of the most dubious kind. It consists merely in the unsupported statements of the booksellers Moseley and Kirkman about the middle of the 17th century, and in the play's presence in the Shakespeare volume of Charles II's library. Internal evidence there is none, unless we accept as such the not very significant likeness of Host Blogg to the host in the Merry Wives of Windsor, a likeness which, as far as it shows anything, shows that the one writer has imitated the other, or that both have found dramatic use for a very common stock type. Tieck was the first critic who ascribed the Merry Devil of Edmonton to Shakespeare. He offered no serious evidence in favor of his theory, but has been followed by 2 other German writers, Franz Hahn and H. von Friesen. No English reader except Hopkinson has been able to detect in this comedy the slightest approach to Shakespeare's manner, and the more trustworthy Elizabethan scholars in Germany, Bondestedt, Ulrichi, Warnke, and Prescholt, are equally incredulous. To 18th century antiquarians, Coexeter and Olds assign the play to Michael Drayton, for no very apparent reason except that the country in which the seed is laid is described in Polyolbion. Charles Lamb and Mr. Flier slightly favor this attribution, while Hazlitt and Ricci describe the comedy to Thomas Hayward instead. There seems no adequate reason to accept either Shakespeare, Drayton, or Heywood as the author of this fine play, and it will probably be long before we can venture with the safety beyond the statement of Knight that it is, quote, "the performance of a true poet, whoever he be," unquote. Certainly, the vitality of the scenes, the heartiness of the humor, and the unsurpassed delicacy in the portrayal of true love and true friendship make the Merry Devil of Edmonton one of the most delightful of all the pseudo-Shakespearean plays to read and to reread. 11. Fair M does not appear to have been registered at Stationers' Hall, though at least 2 early quarto editions were published. One of these, which we shall refer to as Q1, is undated and has the title, quote, "A pleasant comedy of Fair M, the miller's daughter of Manchester, with the law of William the Conqueror, as it was sundry times publicly acted in the honourable city of London by the right honourable the Lord Strange his servants. Imprinted at London for T.N. and I.W. and are to be sold in S. Dunstone's churchyard in Fleet Street." Unquote. The only known copy of this edition is in the Bodleian. The other, somewhat commoner, quarto, has a practically identical title page, except as regards the imprint, which reads, quote, "Printed for John Wright, and are to be sold at his shop at the sign of the Bible in Giltspur Street, without Newgate, 1631. The textual differences between the two editions are for the most part merely orthographic or accidental, but it seems likely that Q1, with its archaic spelling and grammar, is the older by perhaps a generation or more. The play is pretty definitely dated by the statement that it was acted by Lord Strange's servants, for this name was applied to one of the London companies only from 1589 to 1593, and it seems probable that Q1 was published while the memory of the Right Honourable the Lord Strange, his servants, was still fairly fresh in the mind of the publisher and the public to whose tastes he was catering. Q2 is hardly more than a reprint of Q1, occasionally correcting an obvious mistake, but never venturing on the real elucidation, which some passages greatly require. W.R. Chetwood, an 18th century editor of Fair M, enumerates 3 early editions of the play, assigning one to the date 1619. It was this 1619 quarto which Chetwood claimed to follow, but as the alterations which he introduced into the text are certainly not Elizabethan, and as no one else has alluded to the edition of 1619, there is reason to believe it is a mere figment of Chetwood's imagination, devised to give authority to his departure from the text of the 2 genuine quartos. Regarding the authorship of Fair M, we have not a shred of evidence previous to the Restoration. The only 17th century hint of Shakespeare's connection with the play is the label, quote, Shakespeare, Volume 1, unquote, on the back of the book, which contained Fair M, Mucedorus, and the Merry Devil of Edmonton in the library of Charles II. Such small weight as this doubtful testimony may have is quite balanced by the assertion of Edward Phillips in his Theatrum Poetarum that Fair M was written by Robert Greene. Both these ascriptions have found defenders, but it is at present almost certain that neither of the poets suggested was ever in the least degree connected with the writing of our comedy. The theory of Greene's authorship, advanced by Phillips and accepted by Dice, has been discredited by R. Simpson, who shows that 2 lines in the last scene are ridiculed and the unknown author violently attacked in Greene's Farewell to Folly, published in 1591. Tieck, Hone, Hopkinson, and Simpson have imagined that they saw in Fair M indications of Shakespeare's handiwork, but only the last has produced arguments which today deserve even casual consideration. Simpson's idea, which he has elaborated with rather excessive ingenuity, is that Shakespeare wrote Fair M as an allegorical attack on Greene and his school. William the Conqueror represents William Kempe, who had recently led a theatrical company to Denmark. Mountenay typifies Marlowe, Manville Green, and the successful Vallingford, Shakespeare himself, while Fair M symbolizes the prize of the dramatic contest, the Manchester public. This interpretation is accepted in general by Mr. Flier, who, however, ascribes the play to R. Wilson instead of Shakespeare, and explains Vallingford as George Peele, while Fair M, in his judgment, means the company of Queen's players, not the Manchester audience. In regard to the possible allegorical significance of Fair M, the sanest conclusion is doubtless that to which Warnke and Preschault have come. There may be a substratum of allegory beneath the structure of the comedy, but it is only vaguely discernible, if it exists, and fails entirely to support the elaborate edifice of theory which both Mr. Simpson and Mr. Flier have attempted to erect upon it. Mr. Simpson appears to have proved 2 facts. First, that Fair M was not written by Greene, and secondly, that it antedates Greene's Farewell to Folly. It is doubtless equally certain that he has not succeeded in establishing from external evidence even the slightest probability of the play's Shakespearean origin, while he practically admits himself the dramatic character and style of the work tend strongly to negative his arguments. In Fair M, as Charles Knight says, quote, "We look in vain for all that sets Shakespeare so high above his contemporaries. His wit, his humor, his poetry, his philosophy, his intimate knowledge of man, his exquisite method, unquote. Fair M is a thoroughly childish and inartistic production. Its only charm rests in the fact that it exhibits with much of the crudity also something of the hardiness and freshness of childish performances. Regarded as a serious essay in dramatic art, it is full of impossibilities and absurdities, both in the conception of the characters and in the incidents by which the action is carried along. Yet, for the reader who can overlook its puerilities and occasional flatnesses, this indifferent play will probably justify the claim of the title page, that it is, quote, a pleasant comedy, unquote. Fair M might well have been defined in terms dear to the Elizabethan playwrights as, quote, two comedies in one, unquote. Only in the fifth act is there any sort of real connection between the two plots which make up the drama. The source of the story that gives the work its title is so far undiscovered. The other plot, that of William the Conqueror and the Danish court, has been shown by Professor Schick in his scholarly preface to the Spanish tragedy to come from Henry Wotton's Courtly Controversy of Cupid's Cautels, 1578, which is itself a translation of Jacques Vere's Printemps de Vere. The novel which concerns us is the fourth in the collection. It ends tragically with the execution of Lubec and the suicide of William. 12. Of all the doubtful plays, The Two Noble Kinsmen is the one which has inspired the greatest amount of criticism and conjecture. Yet there is perhaps no other member of the class that has so thoroughly maintained the mystery of its authorship, or has so often obliged candid investigators to retract their theories and confess themselves at a loss. This brilliant and puzzling drama was registered April 8th, 1634, and appeared first in quarto, Q, with the interesting title page, quote, The Two Noble Kinsmen, presented at the Blackfriars by the King's Majesty's servants with great applause, written with memorable worthies of their time, Mr. John Fletcher and Mr. William Shakespeare, gentlemen. Printed at London by Theo Coates for Ion Watterson, and are to be sold at the sign of the Crown in Paul's Churchyard, 1634, unquote. The only other 17th century edition is that, F, which was published in 1679, with no mention of Shakespeare's name, in the second Beaumont-Fletcher folio. That this text is only a reprint of Q, with revised spelling, is made clear both from collation and from the express indication at the beginning of the folio that The Two Noble Kinsmen is one of the 17 plays omitted in the first folio of Beaumont and Fletcher, and printed, quote, out of 4-2, unquote. The play has maintained its position in subsequent editions of Beaumont and Fletcher, and has been frequently published of late years, either separately or in collections. The standard edition is that prepared in 1876 for the New Shakespeare Society by Harold Littledale. We first hear of a drama on the subject of Chaucer's Knight's Tale in the accounts of Queen Elizabeth's entertainment at Oxford in 1566. Stowe's Chronicle for August 31st, 1566, contains the following allusion, quote, Comedies, also, and tragedies were played in Christ Church, where the Queen's Highness lodged, among the which the comedy entitled Palamon and Arcette, made by Master Edwards of the Queen's Chapel, had such tragical success as was lamentable, for at that time, by the fall of a wall and a pair of stairs, the great press of the multitude, 3 men were slain, unquote. In Henslow's diary for the months of September, November 1594, occur 4 notices of receipts from the presentation of a play with the same name, quote, Palamon and Arcette, unquote. The letters ni, affixed to the earliest entry, that of September 17th, show that the drama was on that day acted for the first time. Collier's theory is that the work here mentioned is a revision of Edward's old play, prepared by Shakespeare for joint performance by the Lord Chamberlain's and Lord Admiral's companies at the Newington Theatre, and that the Shakespearean portions were later elaborated by Fletcher in The Two Noble Kinsmen. Skeat and Littledale, however, base our play directly on Chaucer, and deny with probable justice that it has any connection with either the earlier dramas just mentioned, both of which are now lost. Modern criticism is unanimous on 2 points. First, that The Two Noble Kinsmen was written by 2 poets, very different in style, genius, and character. Second, that the longer and weaker portion is mainly or exclusively the work of Fletcher. The separation is thus made by Littledale. A. The non-Fletcher part, 1.1, except 1 through 40, part of 2, 3, 4, 2.1, 3.1, 2, nearly all of 4.3, 5.1, except 1 through 19, part of 3, 4, except 99 through 113. B. The Fletcher part, all the rest. The metrical tests have been applied to this play with striking effect. The results of Littledale's reckoning as to the comparative proportion of double endings and run-on lines in the 2 divisions of the work may be tabulated thus. Part not by Fletcher, double endings 1 to 3.49, run-on lines 1 to 1.78, part by Fletcher, double endings 1 to 1.89, run-on lines 1 to 4.06. The utter dissimilarity is obvious at a glance. In fact, there is not the least difficulty in distinguishing the parts except in 1 or 2 prose scenes belonging to the underplot, and in several passages which appear to combine the work of both hands. It is important to note that the style of the un-Fletcherian part of The Two Noble Kinsmen, as represented by the metrical tests, approaches very near to that of The Winter's Tale and The Tempest, and it almost coincides with that of the un-Fletcherian part of Henry VIII, ascribed usually to Shakespeare, but by some recent critics to Massinger. The answer to the long-mooted question as to Shakespeare's part authorship of The Two Noble Kinsmen has always depended, and still depends, on the balancing of the undeniably Shakespearean tone of the style against the quite un-Shakespearean characterization. There are great names in abundance on each side. The authenticity of the so-called Shakespeare parts has been defended by Lamb, Coleridge, De Quincey, Tyrrell, Spalding, Hallam, Hickson, Skeat, Furness, Littledale, Hopkinson, and Swinburne. The number of the skeptics is equally large and no less distinguished, including, strange to say, the usually over-credulous German writers. The case for the negative has been put boldly and truculently by Shelley in a letter to his wife. Quote, "I have been reading The Noble Kinsmen, in which, with the exception of that lovely scene to which you added so much grace in reading to me, I have been disappointed. The jailer's daughter is a poor imitation and deformed. The whole story wants moral discrimination and modesty. I do not believe Shakespeare wrote a word of it." Unquote. The same disbelief has also been expressed by Stevens, Hazlitt, Knight, Orici, Delius, von Friesen, Hallowell Phillips, Boyle, Bierfreund, Furnival, and Frier. In all that pertains to verse form and poetic expression, the un-Fletcherian scenes of The Two Noble Kinsmen must probably impress the majority of readers as more overwhelmingly Shakespearean than any considerable passage in Edward III, Arden of Feversham, or A Yorkshire Tragedy. Yet, in the case of this play, no less certainly than in the case of the others, it seems to be the tendency of good criticism to discredit the idea of Shakespeare's authorship. As Professor Ward says, quote, "The ordinary results of a prolonged reflection on the problem of the authorship of the doubtful portions of The Two Noble Kinsmen seems to be either an increased unwillingness or at least a diminished willingness to decide it in favor of the only specious claim, that which has been advanced on behalf of Shakespeare." Unquote. An interesting case in point is that of Mr. Spalding, who in 1833 defended the geniusness of the Shakespearean scenes in the classic Letter on Shakespeare's authorship of The Two Noble Kinsmen. 7 years later, his opinion was, quote, "not so now decided as it once was," unquote. And in 1847, he had become so doubtful as to declare, quote, "The question of Shakespeare's share in this play is really insoluble," unquote. Similarly, Mr. Flier and Mr. Furnival, who at first accepted the authenticity of the doubtful scenes, came, on maturer consideration, to pronounce them certainly spurious. It is highly improbable that any critical reader of the play has met with a single scene which, after judging it on its own merits, he has been able to pronounce candidly and with absolute confidence to be the work of Shakespeare. It would scarcely be too much to say that there is not even one speech which has ever seemed thoroughly and completely convincing to any conscientious student, no speech, that is, on which he would have been willing to rest the whole question, declaring that just here, if nowhere else, the fingers of the greatest poet of the world have infallibly left their mark. On the contrary, when we consider individually the parts of the two noble kinsmen which have been ascribed to Shakespeare, we find invariably that each act, scene, or verse falls just short of what it should be. Always there is a strong Shakespearean reminiscence, but nowhere quite the full and perfect reality that we could swear to. The advocates of the play's authenticity are therefore driven upon one or the other of two entirely illegitimate courses. Either they argue from vague generalizations of impression, without venturing upon the examination of details, whether of method, characterization, or technique, or they go on in the hypothesis, perfectly unjustifiable and illogical, and we have before us not indeed Shakespeare's work as we all know it, but the same work degraded and weakened by the mischievous revision of Fletcher. On this last assumption, there is no depth of critical absurdity which may not be reached. Admitting once that we are to judge the work of Shakespeare not by what we know it to be, but by what we imagine it might have been after alteration and debasement at the hands of a Fletcher or a Raleigh, we may prove Shakespeare's concern in any wretched play of his age, in Fair M itself if we like, by merely assuming a sufficiently small amount of Shakespearean gold and a relatively large amount of the alloy. That portion of the two noble kinsmen, which is obviously not Fletcher's, contains some of the most brilliant of Jacobean poetry. It is not less certain, I think, that it contains no spark of psychological insight or philosophy of life which can, in sober moments, be thought either worthy of the mature Shakespeare or even suggestive of him. On the utter absurdity of associating Amelia, as she appears in any scene of the play, with Imogen or Miranda, or indeed with any other reputable dramatic heroine, Dr. Furnival appears to have spoken the final word, nor can her coarseness be explained, as critics have attempted to explain the spinelessness of Palamon and Arcite by the theory that Fletcher has marred the promise of Shakespeare's plan. In the most distinctly un-Fletcherian scenes of all, she is what Dr. Furnival has called her, quote, a silly lady's maid or shop girl, not knowing her own mind, up and down like a bucket in a well, unquote. On the dramatic character of the scenes, not Fletcher's, few words require to be said, but they must be strong ones. There are two portions of the play which probably dwell so vividly in every reader's mind as to obscure the recollection of the rest. They are the first scene of the first act and the first scene of the fifth. Both, it need hardly be said, are by another than Fletcher, and neither has much to do with the action of the play. They are, as De Quincey has remarked, examples of the most gorgeous rhetoric, and there is little reason, I think, for adding De Quincey's qualification that they are anything much better. Had the first scene of the two noble kinsmen come in the middle, the play's claim to authenticity would probably have found far fewer supporters. As it is, we are gripped at the very start by the grand operatic opening, the music of the verse, the spectacular effect of the marriage procession met by the somber and hysterical widows, by the swaying of the opposing groups to and fro across the stage, by the cooperative supplication and bending of knees, not singly and individually, but in symmetrical groups, and as it were, to the sound of music. By all the specious claptrap, in fact, which seems to be dramatic action, and is really mere verbiage and ballet dancing. That Shakespeare wrote a syllable of this scene will hardly be believed by any diligent reader who will take the trouble to ask himself what it all means and what its connection with the rest of the play. The other memorable scene is that in which Arcite, Palamon, and Emilia offer their prayers before the altars of their patron deities. Here again, we have an entire lack of dramatic utility or propriety cloaking itself behind spectacular brilliance and fine but unmeaning poetry. The whole incident is, of course, transported bodily from Chaucer's tale, where it is in keeping, to the closing act of the drama, where it most emphatically is not. Two of the speeches, those of Arcite and Emilia, are in De Quincey's words, quote, gorgeous rhetoric, unquote. The third is hardly that. They would make a fine, though somewhat tedious division of an epic poem, but to suppose that they were foisted in by Shakespeare himself at the very climax of his play, and were meant by him for representation before an audience uninterested in mythical rites or divinities, but craving immediate and realistic action, this surely is to strain credulity to the breaking point. In conclusion, we may sum up the matter. Metrical and external evidence agree in proving that, if Shakespeare wrote any of the Two Noble Kinsmen in its present form, he must have done so during the very last period of his career. But, rich as the language and verse are in Shakespearean reminiscence, there is practically nothing in characterization or dramatic structure which points to the author of The Tempest, while such defects as the ambiguous personality of Emilia, the failure properly to distinguish between Palamon and Arcite, and the low dramatic pitch of the doubtful scenes render their ascription to the mature Shakespeare all but unpardonable. The only hypothesis, indeed, on which present-day criticism can even consider the idea of Shakespeare's connection with the Two Noble Kinsmen is that laid down, not very probably, by Mr. Herford, namely, that the play consists of very late, quote, poetic, quote, fragments by Shakespeare, subsequently connected and completed by Fletcher. If we put aside, for the present, the theory of Shakespeare's authorship as being at the very least quite undemonstrable, there remained for consideration the claims of three other poets. George Chapman was suggested by Knight many years ago, but no other writer has accepted the idea as even conceivable, and it need be mentioned only to be rejected. An acute Danish scholar, Dr. Bierfreund, maintains that in his dissertation on Palamon og Arcite, that Beaumont was Fletcher's sole collaborator in The Two Noble Kinsmen, which he believes to be their first joint work. This attribution is favored by the well-known fact of the literary partnership between Beaumont and Fletcher, and by the metrical similarity of Beaumont's verse to that of Shakespeare's last period, and of the Shakespearean part of The Two Noble Kinsmen. Beyond this, however, there seems to be nothing to support Dr. Bierfreund's theory, which, till it is further substantiated, can hardly be regarded as more than an ingenious guess. Undoubtedly, the most serious claimant to the honor, besides Shakespeare, is Philip Massinger, whose cause has been championed by a good deal of ability by Boyle and Flier. In poetic technique, Massinger has been shown to approach nearest of all the Elizabethans to Shakespeare, and the metrical tests give him an even better title than his master to the doubtful part of our play. Moreover, the structural and psychological imperfections of the work, the tendency to unnecessary coarseness of language, the feeble imitation of Shakespeare, the frequent similarity to Massinger's acknowledged writings, all tell us as strongly for Massinger's authorship as against that of Shakespeare. There appears indeed to be but one serious objection to the assumption, otherwise very probable, that The Two Noble Kinsmen was written by Fletcher and Massinger, and that is the magnificent poetry of the unfletcherian part, with which hardly anything in Massinger's accepted work can compare. Prudent criticism will leave the whole question in doubt till more evidence can be obtained. Yet, if a tentative decision is to be made from the facts at present before us, it appears both a more logical and more pleasant course to assume that Massinger should, for once, have risen to the lofty poetry of The Two Noble Kinsmen, than to assume that ripened Shakespeare should have stooped to its low level of character and morality. End of Section 6. Read by Trish Rutter, San Diego, August 14th, 2021. Section 7 of the Shakespeare Apocrypha. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Shakespeare Apocrypha by C.F. Tucker Brooke, Section 7. 13. The Birth of Merlin survives in the late 17th century quarto with the following title, quote, The Birth of Merlin, or The Child Hath His Father, as it hath been several times acted with great applause. Written by William Shakespeare and William Rowley. Plaisir Coupio, London. Printed by Theo Johnson for Francis Kirkman and Henry Marsh, and are to be sold at the Prince's Arms in Chancery Lane, 1662. Unquote. There seems to have been no good second edition till the publication of Tyrrell's Doubtful Plays of Shakespeare in 1851. The spelling of Q, as might be expected, is of the usual Restoration character, and the meter has been corrupted in many cases irretrievably by the printing of the entire play in long prose lines, apparently to save space. From the language and grammar, however, as well from the general tone, it is clear that the Birth of Merlin was not composed later than the reign of James I, nor is it at all likely that it antedates James's accession. Mr. Flier assigns it, in its present form, to the year 1622. There is no external evidence of Shakespeare's partial authorship, except that of the publisher Kirkman, repeated in his catalogues of 1661 and 1671, where we read, quote, Shakespeare and Rowley, Birth of Merlin, Tragi, Comedy, unquote. This attribution, made so long after Shakespeare's death and by a particularly untrustworthy authority, has met with scant respect in modern times, save from the early German critics Tieck and Hone. There is not a single poetic passage in the Birth of Merlin which will justify for an instant the hypothesis of Shakespeare's authorship. The disjointed nature of the plot, moreover, the foolish and immature morality of the Modestia scenes, and the repeated appeals to the cheap makeshifts of sorcery and divination stamp it as distinctively un-Shakespearean. Yet the reader of this play will perceive, as no modern reader of Cromwell or the London Prodigal easily can, what was in the minds of those critics who have defended its genuineness. One meets with occasional bits of poetry and characterization which have certainly a remote kinship to Shakespeare, and were probably written under his influence. In passages like the speeches of Prince Rutter in Act 2, Scene 3, we recognize dimly and afar off the syntactic rush, the ease of verse flow, the figurative power, and sincerity of emotion which we know in Shakespeare. The strength and naturalness of the lines given to Idal in Act 2, Scene 2, show that the author could portray deep passion in lucid, simple verse. But in other places we find what seems to be intentional and rather disastrous imitation of Shakespeare's broken syntax and bold use of words. In these cases, we acknowledge ourselves in the presence of a poet of rather more than respectable endowments, yet we must often feel that the actual value of the thought is hardly sufficient recompense for untwisting the convolutions of a sentence such as this. Quote, Or, like to Marius' soldiers, who o'ertook the eyesight-killing Gorgon at one look, made everlasting stand, so feared my power, whose cloud aspired the sun, dissolved a shower. Unquote. No commentator has seen particular reason to deny William Rowley's concern in the Birth of Merlin, since this Rowley was too obscure a dramatist to be credited with a play without at least hearsay evidence in his favor. Hopkinson assigns the entire performance to Rowley, while Flier, on the other hand, believes his part to consist solely or mainly in the revision of another man's work. Mr. P. A. Daniel, 1884, suggested Middleton as the author of the play, and Mr. Flier at one time accepted this attribution with conviction, at least as regards the serious parts. Till the matter has been much more thoroughly investigated, however, the connection of Middleton with the birth of Merlin must remain quite problematical. It is perhaps an indication in his favor that the detailed legal allusions prove the author to have been one well versed in law, and the fact of his frequent collaboration with William Raleigh adds a little more to the weight of confirmatory evidence. 14. Until 1844, the fine play of Sir Thomas More existed only in a confused, mutilated, and generally unknown manuscript belonging to the British Museum. In that year, it was described by Dyce with admirable fidelity and printed for the Shakespeare Society. Only one other edition with modernized spelling was published in 1902 by A. F. Hopkinson for private circulation. As Mr. Hopkinson did not consult the MS, his variations from Dyce have no claim to consideration except as pure conjecture. The text of Dyce contains a few unintentional deviations from the MS, such as the difficult and varied handwriting of the latter rendered practically unavoidable. These trifling inaccuracies, so far as careful collation has revealed them, have been set right in the present edition. For certain parts of the play, however, Dyce's version must remain the ultimate authority, since a number of words and lines intelligible to him have, by the subsequent deterioration of the MS, become quite indecipherable or have entirely crumbled away. The manuscript consists of 20 sheets, written in 5 different hands. The paper is not of the same kind throughout, and some of the scenes are obviously misplaced. In several cases, we get 2 drafts of the same scene, while small portions of other scenes have been entirely lost. Altogether, the confusion is extreme. Yet, Dyce has succeeded in effecting what appears to be certainly the proper arrangement, and the lunaci are nowhere so great as to obscure the plot. Leaves 3 through 5, 10, 11, 14, 15, 17 through 22 of the MS, comprising about 2/3 of the whole, are undoubtedly older than the rest. These 13 leaves, written closely on both sides of the paper, with a certain amount of neatness and only the usual copyist's errors, belong without doubt to the draft of the play which was submitted to Sir Edmund Tilney, the Master of the Revels, for license to act. On the margins of these pages, we meet from time to time with Tilney's comments, called forth by what he regarded as the seditious nature of various passages. Thus, at the top of the very first page, he has written, quote, "Lee out ye insurrection holy, and cause thereof, and begin with Sir Theo More at ye mayor's sessions, with a report afterwards of his good service done, being sure off London upon a mutiny against ye Lombards, only by short report, and not otherwise at your own perils. E. Tilney." Unquote. The insurrection scene, however, and the other parts to which the Master of the Revels took exception were not left out, but merely recast. There appears indeed to have been no difference of plot between the original version of Sir Thomas More, as submitted to Tilney, and the elaborated form in which the MS preserves it. The new scenes or revisions of the old ones, indescribably finer in several instances as poetry and drama, but adding no fresh element to the general design. In 1 or 2 cases, a page of the original matter has been almost totally hidden by having a new passage pasted bodily over it. The 13 legible leads of the original draft give us the following scenes. Act 1, Scene 1, 2, 3, 2.1, 4, 3.1, 4.1, 2, 3, 4, 5, except new draft of 2, 68 through 104, 5.1, 2, 3, 4. Scraps of other important scenes, such as Act 2, Scene 2, and Scene 3.2, are also occasionally discernible, but the old versions of these parts of the play have generally been deleted or pasted over to prevent confusion with the new improved readings. The original draft of the play, as submitted to Tilney, is in a single hand and runs on almost without blot or correction. It is a clean copy, made perhaps not by the author himself, but by a professional scribe. The latter insertions, however, leaves 6 through 9, 12, 13, 16, are for the most part preserved exactly as they were composed. They are full of deletions and alterations and are written on paper of varying sorts and sizes, in certainly 3, probably 4 different hands, none of which resembles that of the original 13 sheets. If, then, we call the handwriting of the first draft hand A, we may thus indicate the various sorts which appear on the 7 new leaves. Hand B, found only on leaf 6, which contains a revision of the scene between Moore and his wife, 4.5, 68 through 104. This passage of 70 lines was never properly fitted into the play, so that the old version in Hand A has been left standing in its proper place, while the improved, lengthened version in Hand B was negligently inserted between Act 2.1 and Act 2.2. Hand C, occurring on the first page of Leaf 7, 2.2, and on Leaf 16, 4.1, 309, SD, enter a serving man, to the end of scene. Hand D. This is the handwriting which Mr. Simpson and Mr. Spedding have united in assigning to Shakespeare upon evidence of a most interesting character. The only difficulty connected with the discrimination between the various handwritings of the MS concerns itself with this Hand D. Mr. Simpson believed that all the passages in the play which are not in the easily recognizable A, B, and C hands are written in Hand D and by Shakespeare. This would make the latter the author or reviser of the following scenes: 2.3, 4, 1 through 172, 3.2, and 3. Mr. Spedding, on the contrary, recognizes a 5th hand, to which he assigns 2, 3, 3, 2, 1 through 282, 3, 3, and perhaps the remaining part of 3, 2. Thus Spedding leaves to Shakespeare only the magnificent insurrection scene to the end of line 172, and a very doubtful title to the end of 3.2 from line 283. The best judgment on this difficult question seems that kindly given me by Mr. Herbert of the British Museum, who considers all the scenes ascribed by Simpson to Shakespeare to be in one handwriting, with the exception of 3.2, 283 to the end. In agreement with this opinion, we divide as follows: Hand D, 2.3, 4, 1 through 172, 3.2, 1 through 282, 3. Hand E, 3.2, 283 to the end. The manuscript of Sir Thomas More contains no direct statement in regard to the play's origin. The questions of authorship, date, and stage production are all left dark, except for such doubtful light as a few casual allusions in the body of the text may shed. That the drama belongs to the end of the 16th century, and probably not to the extreme end, is indicated by several considerations. In Act 4, Scene 1, there occurred 2 anachronistic references to Ogle, a theatrical wig maker mentioned in Cunningham's Revels accounts for 1573, and again under date of 1584. As one of the players is represented as leaving Moore's house to get from Ogle a false beard, with which he later appears, the realistic effect of the illusion would have been lost had not Ogle's shop been in actual existence when the drama was produced. Dice suggested 1590, or just before, as the date of the play, and Simpson, who regarded the insurrection scenes as inspired by a similar outbreak in 1586, decided positively for that year or the next. Mr. Flier, on the other hand, supported by Hopkinson, pronounced 1595 through 6 the earliest probable date, and refers to a rising in June 1595, which might well have given a positiveness to the insurrection scenes and rendered them particularly distasteful to the master of the revels. The two dates proposed by Simpson and Flier, respectively, may safely be accepted as determining the period within which Sir Thomas More was written. The editions were most likely composed soon after the body of the play. This is almost certainly true of More's magnificent speech in defense of order and humanity in 2.4, intended obviously as a balance to the revolutionary scenes which so displeased Tilney. Without such make-weight on side of the law, no theatre manager, however bold, could well have ventured to perform the first part of the play in the face of the tremendous prohibition. Quote, "Lee out ye insurrection wholly, and the cause thereof, at your own perils." Unquote. The most probable explanation of the number of hands concerned in the work and the extraordinary disorder of the MS seems to be that the manager, anxious to act the play with the least possible loss of time, but afraid to run directly counter to authority, turned the original draft over to several writers, each of whom hastily revised what seemed to him most glaringly in need of alteration. There is reason for believing that Sir Thomas More was acted by the Lord Chamberlain's servants. Before the speech of the messenger in 3.3, the MS writes, Monsieur T. Godal, which of course means that the messenger's part was to be taken by T. Godal. Thomas Goodall, who is here indicated, is known to have been, in 1592, a subordinate member of the Lord Strange's company, later called Lord Chamberlain's. Such discussion as this play has received hitherto has concerned itself chiefly with the interesting possibility that the scenes in Hand D, or some part of them, may be directly from the pen and brain of Shakespeare. The theory of Shakespearean part authorship was evolved by Richard Simpson in 1871 and supported in the following year by James Spedding, with the differences as to detail already specified. Mr. Hopkinson has accepted their general conclusions, and Professor Ward, declaring his inability to judge concerning the genuineness of the so-called Shakespearean handwriting, goes on to say, quote, "As to the style and manner of the passages in question, not only may the speeches of More, in particular that addressed to the insurgents, which may have been specially elaborated to suit the requirements of the licenser, be said without hesitation to have the true Shakespearean manner, besides being genuinely Shakespearean in feeling. But it is with difficulty that they can be conceived to have been written by any other contemporary author." Unquote. Dr. Furnival, on the other hand, doubts that the text of the insurrection scene, and C in the MS, is in Shakespeare's writing, and says of this portion of the play that there is, quote, "nothing necessarily in Shakespearean in it, though part of it is worthy of him." Unquote. Mr. Flier appears likewise to be incredulous. The difficult question raised by these dissimilar opinions would be much easier of solution if we could, with Spedding, dismiss all but the supreme passage in the play, the culminating insurrection scene and the speech of More, as written in a different hand, and therefore not belonging to the Shakespearean matter. This, it must be said in candor, we are perhaps hardly justified in doing. All the scenes enumerated on page 49 as belonging to Hand D, including the relatively weak Randall Erasmus More passages in 3.2 and the even more commonplace 2.3, may very probably be in the same handwriting. Moreover, it is practically certain from the appearance of the MS of the insurrection scene, as will be indicated later, that the handwriting is that of the author. If, therefore, we decide that 2.4, 1 through 172, is written and composed by Shakespeare, then we should be prepared to accept 2.3, 3.2, 1 through 282, 3.3 as at least transcribed in Shakespeare's hand. The first 72 lines of the insurrection scene appear to me more thoroughly in tone of Shakespeare than any other passage in the doubtful plays. There is possibly more striking poetry in Edward III and the two noble kinsmen, and greater intensity of feeling in parts of Arden of Feversham, but it would be difficult or impossible to find, outside the plays of the ordinary canon, any extract of similar length which reminds the reader so strongly and lastingly of the special peculiarities of Shakespeare's genius. We get something of the familiar ring in the very first sentence. Lincoln's appeal to the unruly mob he has gathered about him. Quote, Lincoln, peace, hear me. He that will not see a red herring at a hairy groat, butter at 11 pence a pound, meal at 9 shillings a bushel, and beef at four nobles a stone, list to me. George Bet, yet will come to that pass if strangers be suffered. Mark him. Unquote. This, and the speeches that follow inevitably, suggest Jack Cade and his company in 2 Henry VI. The perception of the individual Shakespearean touch grows stronger in the mob's clamorous debate as to whether Shrewsbury, Surrey, or More is to address them, a debate decided finally for More with the true mob logic of Shakespeare. Quote, dull. Let's hear him. A keeps a plentiful shreveltree, and a maid my brother Arthur Watchkins, Surreyant safes yeoman. Let's hear Shreve More. All. Shreve More, 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 Shreve More. Unquote. The speech of More, which follows, is praised on all hands both for its splendid poetry and for its likeness to Shakespeare. But it, as well as the earlier part of the scene, must be read in its entirety to be appreciated. The numerous parallels of word and phrase with the acknowledged works will not escape the notice of any reader. Equally apparent and generally recognized is the similarity to Shakespeare's early style in all matters of technique. The bold, figurative use of words, the rich smoothness of verse, and the total absence of strain or affectation at the height of poetic intensity mark these lines as not less Shakespearean in metrical quality than any part of the Two Noble Kinsmen or Edward III. The top scene of Sir Thomas More, however, exhibits the surest indication of Shakespearean authorship, just where the claim of all other doubtful plays breaks down. That is, when we judge it dramatically rather than poetically, giving less regard to the manner and more to the matter. The 172 lines in question say precisely what we should expect Shakespeare, the man, the dramatist, to say. We have here the same attitude toward the mob, half good-natured laughter, half scorn and distrust, and the same eloquent championship of law and order against anarchic tendencies, which appears so consistently throughout the genuine works. Moreover, the insurrection scene satisfies fully the almost decisive test of utility, whereas the so-called Shakespearean portion of Edward III splits the play into two irreconcilable halves, and the analogous scenes in the Two Noble Kinsmen seldom touch at all the dramatic crises, which are regularly left to the pen of Fletcher. The author of the insurrection scene in Sir Thomas More has turned his attention to the crucial point in the drama, and has revised it in just the way which best answers the requirement, both of stage effect and of managerial prudence. It is not too much to say of this scene, by way of summary, that it is exactly the sort of scene we should expect Shakespeare to write, had he been called upon to revise the play, full of his well-known sentiments and expressed in a style which is remarkably like his own during the period 1590 through 5. If these lines are really by Shakespeare, we have a most interesting illustration of the method of composition during his early maturity. The frequent interlineations and substitutions of one phrase for another show how the work took form as it proceeded, and make it evident that the sheet of paper on which this scene is written in the Harleian MS contains the author's first draft, set down line by line as the passage evolved itself in his brain. In the final version, 2.132 FF, read as follows, quote, "Wash your foul minds with tears, and those same hands that you like rebels lift against the peace, lift up for peace, and your venerant knees make them your feet to kneel to be forgiven. Tell me but this, what rebel captain, as mutinies are incident by his name, can still the rout?" Unquote. NC. These fine lines were not arrived at without difficulty. In their first form, there was a pause after feet in 135, which after the poet wrote, quote, "To kneel to be forgiven is safer wars than you can make, whose discipline is right. Why, in your wars cannot proceed but by obedience. What rebel captain?" Unquote. N.C. This failed to satisfy him and caused him an obvious struggle before it could be remodeled to his taste. First, he deleted wars at the end of the third line and wrote instead Hurley, apparently because of the presence of wars in the preceding line. Then, as a substitute for why, Hurley, he has written above, quote, into your obedience, unquote, which in turn is lined out with all the rest to be replaced by the single half line, quote, tell me but this, unquote. At the same time, apparently, the pause in 135 was shifted from the middle to the end of the line. Of the other scenes, possibly written in hand D, only the soliloquy of Moore, 3.2, 1 through 21, and the comic Faulkner passages seem at all worthy of Shakespeare. They, however, may doubtless be attributed to him, without excessive temerity, as careless revisionary work, fundamentally similar in style and tone to his genuine performances, but naturally more hasty and somewhat less spirited. 2.3, the Erasmus part of 3.2 and the whole of 3.3 must be allowed to be decidedly un-Shakespearean. But of the last two of these passages, it is quite certain, and it is extremely probable of the first, that the person who transcribed them in hand D, was not in any real sense of their author. The two Erasmus bits of 3.2, 22 through 47, and 142 through 240, and the two Faulkner bits, 48 through 141 and 241 to the end, alternate with each other and are not easily separated. From the scraps of the old version of the scene in hand A, which are still legible, it appears that the Erasmus part was largely copied with only casual embellishments by the reviser, while the Faulkner part is remodeled and immensely improved. Thus, the Erasmus passages are basically the work of the original author of the play and have been rewritten in hand D with merely incidental improvements because they are wedged into the same scene with the Faulkner episode to which the reviser gave serious attention. The brief and tame scene 3 of the third act is copied in hand D, verbatim, except for the insertion of the single word Heather from the original draft written in hand C just after 4.1. It is clear that Scribe C, having added to 4.1, the final lines, 310 through 68, used the remaining half sheet of paper for the sketch of a much-needed connecting scene between the third act and the fourth. The deletions prove the priority of this copy of the scene to that in hand D. Line 5, for instance, was first written, quote, as sent to tell your lordship of his coming, unquote. Then, the first two words were deleted, and the last three replaced by, quote, that they are at hand, unquote, which later was also scratched out in favor of the final reading, quote, of the near approach, unquote. Scribe D has merely copied the scene in its final form, inserting, quote, Heather in line 3 for the sake of the meter, and has pasted his copy where the scene obviously belongs, at the end of Act 3. What is certainly true of the Erasmus parts in 3.2 and of 3.3 is in the highest degree likely of 2.3, the only other mediocre scene in hand D. Here, too, the scribe seems to have been not the author, but merely the theatrical arranger, though from the incomplete state of the MS, it is not possible in this case to compare the revised version with the original. Setting these scenes aside, then, we are left with the first 172 lines of 2.4 and the three passages from 3.2, 1 through 21, 48 through 141, 241 through 282, all of which are written in hand D, and are, in large measure, composed by the writer. Though these 300 lines, we meet the same general characteristics, though they display themselves in greater freedom and grandeur in the completely new cast insurrection scene than in the merely revised and elaborated passages of 3.2. When we consider this part of Sir Thomas More in its poetic and particularly in its dramatic and personal aspects, taking into account the play's probable date and the probable company by which it was acted, it is hardly possible to withstand the conviction that if Shakespeare was ever concerned with any of the apocryphal plays, then surely it was with this. Of the body of the play, little need be said, though Sir Thomas More ranks high among the productions of its decade. Lack of unity is a defect inherent in the style of a composition, but the absence of anything like a consecutive plot is to some extent atoned for by the effectiveness of More's genial character. The really attractive personality of the central figure and the genuine spirit of lightheartedness which inspires even the tragic scenes are two merits covering a multitude of imperfections and raising Sir Thomas More far above the flatness of Oldcastle and Cromwell. In no work of the period do we get a more vivid portrayal of the management of an aristocratic household. The dinner to the Lord Mayor, the picture of More in the midst of his family circle, and the glimpse behind the scenes of a Tudor morality are charming bits of domesticity which it would not be easy to parallel in the range of Elizabethan dramatic literature. The main source of the drama is doubtless Hall's Chronicle, from which Dice quotes illustrative excerpts. However, the story of More's life and death was such common property in the reign of Elizabeth that it is unsafe, perhaps, to fix upon any one authority. I have found an account of the fight in Pannier Alley and of the episode of the long-haired Faulkner, 3.2, in Fox's Book of Martyrs, edited 1684 to 431, where both incidents are related in connection with Thomas Cromwell. The stock account of More's execution, very much as it appears in the play, will be found in the same work, 294. The authorship of Sir Thomas More, in its first form, has been assigned to Lodge, whose doubtful claim is favored by Fliet and Hopkinson. A few words remain to be said regarding the editorial history of the Shakespeare Apocrypha. Of the 14 plays here printed, all but the recently discovered Sir Thomas More have suffered at the hands of late 16th and 17th century editors. During the period which began with Kirkman and culminated with Malone, Campbell, and Stevens, critical energies were engaged here as elsewhere in the well-meant but mischievous task of leveling out grammatical archaisms and normalizing the frequently rough or irregular flow of the lines. Under this regime, which shows itself almost at its worst in the emendations of the modern German critics Delius, Moltke, and Ilza, the present plurals in s, for example, and such expressions as thou was, disappeared, while the hugy monsters of Locrine reappeared as the hugest monsters. At this time, the frequent 9-syllable lines of the originals and the lines in which words like grace, fear, Lord, were pronounced in 2 syllables, were made arithmetically orthodox by the insertion of some colorless monosyllable. Thus in Cromwell, instead of the correct old reading, quote, well, hath your Grace said, my Lord of Norfolk, therefore let us presently to Lambeth, unquote, we find in Malone's and every succeeding text, quote, well, hath your Grace said, my good Lord of Norfolk, therefore let us go presently to Lambeth. In the last 2 acts of this one play, 34 words have been thus unwarrantedly inserted, and a number of omissions is almost as great. Only within the last few decades has any attempt been made to purge the text of the apocryphal plays of the impurities which all had accumulated during the long period of careless or ill-advised editing. Even since the beginning of the 19th century, edition after edition has reprinted the insipid texts of the later quartos and Malone, or has differed only in the incorporation of yet other unnecessary emendations. For 200 years there has not appeared a reliable version of Locrine, Mucedorus, Sir John Oldcastle, Thomas Lord Cromwell, the London Prodigal, the Puritan, or a Yorkshire tragedy. and that too notwithstanding the fact that all these plays, except Mucedorus, are included in the 3rd and 4th Shakespeare folios, and that all of them, in their garbled form, have been many times reprinted. The other 7 plays have in recent times been edited from the original quarto texts with varying accuracy. Undoubtedly, the most valuable of these editions are the standard text for The Two Noble Kinsmen and Sir Thomas More by Littledale and Dyce, respectively. Arden of Feversham has been carefully edited by Mr. Bullen and independently by the indefatigable German scholars Warnke and Proscholt, to whom we owe also editions of Edward III, The Merry Devil of Edmonton, The Birth of Merlin, Fair M, and Mucedorus. The value of the text by Warnke and Proscholt differs considerably. The earliest, that of Mucedorus, cannot be accepted as critical edition at all, though well provided with apparatus criticus and laboriously prepared. Of the many quartos, only the 8th has been consulted at first hand, and the editors have made the fatal mistake of adopting as the readings of the 1st and 3rd quartos, respectively, what are in reality the silent emendations of Hazlitt and Collier. Fair M, the second of the plays edited by Warnke and Proscholt, is better done. The spelling is not modernized, as in their text of Mucedorus, and the 2 old quartos have really been collated. Yet numberless small corrections are required to render this edition at all authoritative. In some way, which would be difficult to explain, the orthography and variant readings of the 2 quartos have been so mixed that the resultant text gives no faithful representation of either. The editors appear to have profited by experience, for they have had much more success with the other 4 plays published by them, namely, The Merry Devil of Edmonton, Edward III, The Birth of Merlin, and Arden of Feversham. In these editions, the text of the earliest quarto is in each case pretty faithfully preserved, while the list of variant readings is full and on the whole exact. As might be expected, in transcribing from the originals, a good many unintentional deviations in spelling have been made, and occasional errors in more important matters require correction. It is to be regretted that conjectural emendations by Professor Else and other modern critics have so frequently been admitted into the text without absolute necessity. On the whole, however, these editions deserve the favorable opinions they have received on many hands. Preface to the Second Impression. In the present impression, about 75 misprints or textual errors are corrected, and about 15 positive blemishes in the introduction and the notes have been removed. Early versions of all the plays included have now appeared in this series of tutor facsimile texts, and the Malone Society has produced editions of Locrine, Oldcastle, and Sir Thomas More. In particular, Dr. Gregg's very careful work on the More manuscript, furthered by the stripping of the previously covered leaves, has been rewarded by the establishment of essentially better readings. The most important addenda to the bibliography are the following. F. W. Moorman, quote, plays of uncertain authorship attributed to Shakespeare, unquote, Cambridge History of England Literature, Volume 5, 1910, pages 236 through 58. O. Peterson, Pseudo-Shakespearic Dramen, Anglia, 1913, 424 through 62. H. Dugdale Sykes, quote, The Authorship of a Yorkshire Tragedy, unquote, Journal of England and German Philosophy, July 1917. Professor J. M. Manley's edition of The Merry Devil of Edmonton in Representative English Comedies, Volume 2, 1913, containing a new suggestion of the play's source. George W. Mannell, quote, The Source of Immediate Plot of Fair M, unquote, Modern Language Notes, March 1913. H. Dugdale Sykes, quote, The Authorship of Two Noble Kinsmen, Modern Language Review, April 1916, unquote. L. L. Schuching, quote, Das Datum des Pas sur Sir Thomas More, unquote. English Studies, 46, 1912 through 13, 228 through 51. W. W. Gregg, quote, autograph plays by A. Munday, unquote, ascribing one of the hands of the Moore MS to Munday, Modern Language Review, January 1913. Sir Edwin Maund Thompson, quote, Shakespeare's handwriting, identifying one of the hands as Shakespeare's, unquote, Oxford, 1916. Percy Simpson, quote, the play of Sir Thomas More and Shakespeare's hand in it, unquote, The Library, January 1917. Yale University, December 1917. End of Section 7. Read by Trish, Rutter, San Diego, August 1st, 2021. End of the Shakespeare Apocrypha by C.F. Tucker Brooke.